This is a quiet look at the hidden systems, restricted spaces, and controlled knowledge that shaped the city of Rome. Rome was never meant to be fully seen or fully understood. Some places were always out of reach. Some knowledge was kept behind closed doors. Many of the city's most important workings stayed out of sight, moving beneath the surface, shaping daily life without drawing attention. The focus here is the city of Rome itself, from its beginnings in the 6th century BCE, through the centuries that followed, across the heart of Italy. These are the years when Rome grew from a cluster of hills into a world capital, and then into a place where the old stones faded into the ground and new lives built on top of them. The strongest pressure here is control. In Rome, control showed up in quiet ways. Streets disappeared under new layers of stone. Rivers ran underfoot, hidden from view. Temples stood closed to most, their doors locked to nearly everyone. Some people held knowledge that others were never meant to have. At night, the city changed, and many learned to move quietly, or not at all. Memory itself could be locked away, and the city's own laws were sometimes kept from the eyes of its people. Even the buildings where most Romans lived were allowed to fall apart, while prisons kept their silence and their secrets. This video moves through these years and places, from the buried Forum to the rivers under the streets, from the silence of the Vestals to the locked archives and the quiet ruins that still lie beneath today's city. The pace will stay gentle and steady. There will be no sudden sounds or sharp changes. You can let your mind rest as you listen. Take a moment to get comfortable. Let the quiet weight of old Rome settle around you. There is nothing you need to do now except relax. At the heart of ancient Rome, the Forum occupied a basin-shaped hollow, encircled by the Capitoline, Palatine, and Esquiline hills. In the 6th century BCE, this area presented a daunting landscape for any ambitious builder or city planner. Water drained down from the surrounding slopes, collecting in the lowest ground and transforming the site into a marshy expanse. The original topography, as recorded in ancient sources and reflected in archaeological evidence, was one of persistent dampness and instability. The land was prone to pooling water, particularly after heavy rainfall, and the sluggish runoff from the hills made the ground soft and unreliable for large-scale construction or regular movement. The earliest Romans, faced with these conditions, attempted to impose order on the unruly terrain. By the end of the 7th century BCE, parts of the Forum had already been raised and pebble-paved in localized efforts to improve drainage and create stable foundations. However, these interventions provided only limited relief. Large portions of the area remained vulnerable to standing water and seasonal flooding, which threatened to render the space unusable for gatherings or markets. A decisive step in transforming the Forum's landscape came in the 6th century BCE with the construction of the Cloaca Maxima. Ancient authors attribute this ambitious drainage project to the early Tarquin kings who ruled Rome during the city's regal period. The Cloaca Maxima began as an open channel, cut through the marshy ground to provide an outlet for stagnant water. Its path was designed to collect runoff from the Forum and surrounding areas, directing it toward the Tiber River. The scale of the work demanded considerable labor and organization, with contemporary Roman historiography emphasizing the effort required to excavate, line, and maintain the channel. The builders not only contended with the waterlogged earth, but also with the challenge of keeping the drainage works clear in the face of silt and debris washed down from the hills. Even with the Cloaca Maxima in operation, the Forum's vulnerability to flooding persisted. Ancient sources record that overflow from the Tiber could still inundate the area, particularly during periods of heavy rain, when both river and hill runoff converged on the low ground. These episodes of flooding periodically disrupted the Forum's use, making movement difficult and impeding the activities that the space was intended to support. The accounts do not name specific individuals or institutions responsible for addressing these challenges beyond the attribution to the Tarquin kings, but they do describe the labor-intensive nature of early drainage and reclamation efforts. The usability and accessibility of the forum, especially in times of flood, remained a recurring concern in Roman accounts, underscoring the ongoing struggle to master the terrain. As centuries passed, the Romans continued their efforts to transform the forum from a marshy hollow into the city's public center. During the Republican and Imperial periods, the ground level of the forum underwent a gradual but significant elevation. This process unfolded through a combination of natural and human-driven factors. Sediment carried by floods and hill erosion accumulated on the forum floor, raising the surface incrementally. At the same time, deliberate construction projects, paving, rebuilding, and the erection of new monuments added further layers to the ground. Archaeological stratigraphy in the forum provides clear evidence of this cumulative process. Multiple sequences of paving and fill deposits have been uncovered, each corresponding to distinct phases of construction and repair. In the early Republican period, the need to counteract the effects of flooding and unstable ground led to the laying down of new surfaces above existing ones. Over time, the original level of the forum became buried beneath successive strata of stone, gravel, and debris. Historical accounts and technical treatises of the period document the evolution of these building practices. In the 3rd century BCE, the Cloaca Maxima itself was transformed from an open channel into an enclosed sewer, with a stone barrel vault constructed to carry stormwater more efficiently beneath the surface. This engineering innovation altered both the surface and subsurface works in the forum area, allowing for more ambitious construction above ground while continuing to manage drainage below. As the city grew and the needs of its population changed, major episodes of rebuilding reshaped the forum's layout and appearance. New streets, shops, and monuments were constructed atop the remnants of earlier phases. Archaeological excavations have revealed how earlier paving stones, shop foundations, and decorative elements were entombed beneath later works. In some cases, entire streets and open spaces disappeared from view, rendered inaccessible as the ground level rose. The stratified remains of these buried features, preserved beneath layers of fill and masonry, attest to the forum's continuous transformation. Contemporaneous sources occasionally remark on the disappearance or inaccessibility of earlier streets and spaces. While they do not always provide detailed descriptions, they acknowledge the phenomenon of older layers being overtaken by new construction. The cumulative effect of these repeated interventions was the creation of a complex, multi-layered urban landscape. By the end of the imperial period, the visible surface of the forum rested atop a palimpsest of buried streets, foundations, and drainage works, each marking a stage in the city's ongoing adaptation to its environment. Within this evolving landscape, daily movement and activity unfolded on surfaces that, in time, would themselves become hidden from view. The earliest forum pavements supported gatherings, markets, and public business, providing a stage for the routines of Roman life. Material remains recovered from these buried levels include fragments of paving stone and terracotta decoration, some dating as far back as the 6th century BCE. Archaeological investigations have identified patterns of wear on these surfaces, as well as evidence of repeated repairs and repaving, consistent with sustained use by foot traffic, carts, and the daily bustle of commerce. The layout and appearance of these early forum streets can be partially reconstructed from the surviving material. Paving stones were often set in herringbone or regular courses, with drainage channels running alongside to carry away surface water. The use of terracotta and stone for decorative elements and curbstones added visual interest and helped define the boundaries of open spaces and thoroughfares. The accessibility and visibility of these areas changed over time, as new layers were added above them. As the surface of the Forum rose, the older streets and spaces became increasingly difficult to reach, their outlines preserved only in the archaeological record. Contemporary Roman authors comment on the shifting ground level and the impact of filling, paving, and drainage works on the Forum's condition. They describe a space in flux, with its surface constantly being renewed, repaired, or raised in response to both natural forces and human ambition. While these accounts rarely name specific individuals or groups associated with daily life on the early Forum surfaces, they evoke the collective experience of movement and activity in a landscape shaped by ongoing adaptation. Archaeological evidence of wear, repair, and modification on the buried levels of the Forum further illustrates the intensity of use that these spaces once supported. Paving stones show grooves and polish from countless footsteps and wheels. In places, repairs with new materials or patchwork paving mark efforts to maintain the surface in the face of heavy use or damage. Over time, as new construction projects demanded a higher ground level, these well-worn surfaces were covered over, their traces preserved beneath the next layer of urban life. The reality of daily movement and activity on the now inaccessible levels of the Forum is thus made tangible through both the physical remains and the written record. The early streets and gathering spaces, once the heart of Rome's public life, became the foundations, literal and figurative, upon which later generations built their own version of the city's center. Each layer tells the story of adaptation, to water, to changing needs, and to the relentless drive to create a usable, enduring civic space. By the close of the 4th century CE, the Forum stood as a testament to centuries of struggle with the natural environment and to the ingenuity of those who sought to master it. The ground beneath the feet of citizens was not a single unchanging surface, but a complex accumulation of solutions, each responding to the challenges of its time. The buried streets and vanished spaces, unseen yet ever present, formed the silent underpinnings of Rome's most iconic public square. Along the ancient approaches to Rome, the aqueducts stood as unmistakable landmarks of Roman ingenuity and ambition. Travelers and citizens alike could see these monumental structures striding across the countryside, their arcades marching in measured rhythm over valleys and plains. The Aqua Appia, completed in 312 BC, set an early precedent for concealment. As it drew close to the city, its course vanished almost entirely from view, hidden beneath the earth. Unlike the later, more conspicuous arches of the Aqua Claudia or Anio Novus, the earliest aqueducts often preferred the protection and secrecy of the underground. The reasons for this were not merely technical, but also strategic. In the unsettled conditions of the early Republic, burying the conduits shielded them from attack and tampering. Literary records and archaeological evidence alike confirm that, as aqueducts neared Rome's boundaries, above-ground arcades would yield to masonry-lined tunnels and subterranean channels. These transitions often occurred at key entry points, such as where the conduits passed through city gates, or skirted the ancient Servian wall. The physical act of water disappearing beneath Rome was neither dramatic nor ostentatious. In some locations, aqueducts approached the city on arches, only to descend into the ground at a carefully engineered angle, their channels lined with waterproof hydraulic mortar. Masonry work at these entry points was robust, designed to withstand both the pressure of water and the encroachments of time. The conduits themselves were cut through rock or built as vaulted tunnels, their interiors accessible to maintenance workers where the diameter allowed. Archaeological remains of these transitions have been uncovered in several places around Rome, revealing the original fabric of the channels and the care with which they were sealed and protected. In certain stretches, the buried sections were broad enough for an adult to walk upright, an intentional feature for inspection and repair. The transition from visible aqueduct to hidden conduit was not merely a matter of construction, but also of control. Roman public officials, whose duties included oversight of the city's water supply, were responsible for maintaining the integrity of these entry points. Their authority extended to regulating access, ensuring that only authorized personnel could inspect or repair the buried channels. Contemporary texts suggest that deliberate burial was, at times, a defensive measure, particularly during the turbulent years of the early Republic. The presence of masonry-lined shafts and access hatches, some locked or guarded, points to a system in which secrecy and security were valued as highly as engineering precision. For the majority of Rome's population, the moment when water left the open air and slipped beneath the city was a matter of mystery, not observation. Contemporary accounts do not describe widespread public knowledge or curiosity regarding these transitions. The aqueducts were seen and admired at the city's edge, but as the water entered the hidden arteries beneath the streets, it became part of the unseen machinery of urban life. What happened below ground was the province of officials and engineers, not the ordinary citizen. By the time the water re-emerged, at fountains, baths, or private homes, its journey through darkness was all but forgotten. Thus, the process by which Rome's water became invisible was both a feat of design and a subtle act of concealment, shaping the city's relationship with its most vital resource. Once the water had passed into the city's hidden conduits, its journey was far from over. The distribution of water within Rome was managed through a complex network of castella distribution tanks, where the flow from the aqueducts was received, settled, and divided. These castella served as the city's internal reservoirs, strategically placed to redistribute water to various districts and users. Archaeological discoveries, such as the castellum found south of the modern Trevi Fountain, provide concrete evidence of these structures functioning as storage and settling tanks within the urban fabric. From these points, water was channeled into smaller pipes, fistulae made of lead or ceramic, branching off via bronze fittings known as calyces. The allocation of water was not a casual affair. Fees or charges were levied for private connections to the public supply, and the cost depended on the size of the calyx used to draw water from the castellum. The larger the calyx, the greater the flow permitted, and thus the higher the fee. Permission for such connections was not granted lightly. Waterworks inspectors and municipal officials were tasked with issuing authorizations, overseeing the construction of new connections, and ensuring that each calyx matched the approved dimensions. These officials operated under a framework of regulations that governed every aspect of water access and distribution. The process was meticulously recorded. Applications, inspections, and payments were all documented, reflecting the administrative sophistication of Rome's water management. Monitoring and adjusting the flow of water at these control points required both technical skill and administrative vigilance. Valves and branch fittings allowed for the regulation of water pressure and volume, enabling officials to respond to the city's shifting needs. Engineering treatises and administrative records from the period describe methods for measuring flow, detecting leaks, and balancing supply among competing users. The Praefectus Aquarum, an official established in the imperial period, held ultimate responsibility for the city's aqueducts and water distribution. This office was more than ceremonial. It wielded real authority over the maintenance, allocation, and protection of the water supply. One of the most detailed sources on Rome's water administration is Sextus Julius Frontinus, who served as curator aquarum in the late 1st century AD. His writings provide a rare glimpse into the procedures and personnel involved in the oversight of the aqueducts. Frontinus described the duties of inspectors, the importance of regular maintenance, and the necessity of accurate record-keeping. He also noted the frequent disputes and challenges that arose regarding distribution, leakage, and unauthorized tapping. These conflicts were not rare, They reflected the high value placed on water in a city where demand often exceeded supply. Administrative records and literary sources from both the late Republic and the early Empire document the existence of regulations and laws concerning water access. These rules were enforced by a hierarchy of officials, from local inspectors to the Praefectus Aquarum himself. The system was designed to ensure fairness, efficiency, and the protection of public resources. Yet, as the records attest, the hidden nature of the water system made it vulnerable to abuse. Disputes over allocation, complaints about insufficient flow, and allegations of illegal diversions were recurring features of urban life. Nonetheless, the mechanisms and authorities controlling Rome's hidden water systems were robust, reflecting a blend of engineering acumen and bureaucratic discipline. Despite the elaborate systems of control and oversight, the hidden nature of Rome's water infrastructure created opportunities for illicit activity. Ancient authors and official reports record numerous instances of illegal tapping and unauthorized diversions from the aqueducts and their conduits. These acts of water theft were not always the work of desperate individuals. Sometimes they were carried out by those with the means and knowledge to exploit the system. The challenge of detecting and preventing such offenses was a persistent concern for Roman authorities. In 1405 BC, a commission investigated the state of Rome's aqueducts and found that the conduits were decayed and that illegal tapping had significantly depleted the city's water supplies. This discovery prompted immediate restoration efforts, highlighting the seriousness with which the authorities viewed the problem. Legal penalties and prosecutions for illegal tapping are documented in Roman administrative sources and legal commentaries. The penalties could be severe, reflecting the essential role of water in the life of the city. Frontinau, during his tenure as curator aquarum, devoted considerable attention to the detection and punishment of illegal connections. He described the methods used to uncover unauthorized taps, including careful inspection of conduits and monitoring of water flow at distribution points. Offenders, once identified, faced a range of enforcement measures. Illegal taps were sealed or removed, repairs were made to damaged conduits, and legal action was taken against those responsible. The process was systematic and, where possible, thorough. Named officials such as Quintus Marcius Rex are recorded as having undertaken major restorations and measures specifically aimed at addressing conduit decay and unauthorized diversions in the 2nd century BC. The legal framework for prosecuting water theft was supported by specific laws and edicts. These regulations defined what constituted illegal tapping, set out the penalties for offenders, and empowered officials to act decisively in defense of the public supply. Administrative records from the period provide evidence of both successful enforcement and the ongoing challenges posed by those seeking to circumvent the rules. The prevalence of such cases suggests that the temptation to access water illicitly was strong, especially in a city where the hidden nature of the conduits made detection difficult. Contemporary sources do not provide extensive detail on public attitudes toward water theft, but the frequency of official reports and the seriousness of the penalties indicate that unauthorized access was regarded as a significant offense. Rumors and suspicions about illicit taps circulated in the city, adding an undercurrent of mistrust to the otherwise orderly management of the water system. For the authorities, the task was clear: to protect Rome's hidden rivers from those who would exploit their secrecy for private gain. Thus, the risks and consequences of unauthorized access to Rome's hidden water systems were well established by the administrative and legal structures of the day. The city's water supply, though largely invisible to its inhabitants, was guarded by a vigilant network of officials, inspectors, and engineers. The penalties for transgression were real, and for many, a powerful deterrent. Yet, as the records show, the struggle to maintain the integrity of Rome's hidden rivers was an ongoing challenge, one that demanded constant vigilance and a deep understanding of both the city's needs and the vulnerabilities of its subterranean lifelines. In the end, the vast majority of Romans experienced their water as a gift of the city, appearing miraculously at fountains, baths, and homes, with little sense of the elaborate systems that governed its journey. The aqueducts, so visible on the horizon, became invisible within the city, their waters flowing through channels known only to a select few. The administrators, engineers, and inspectors who maintained these hidden rivers operated in a world apart, their duties crucial yet largely unseen. For most, the water's origin and passage remained a mystery, its arrival a silent testament to the power and complexity of Rome itself. Beneath the surface of ancient Rome, the Cloaca Maxima began its long history as an answer to the city's most pressing environmental challenge, the persistent marshes and stagnant waters that threatened both health and the expansion of urban life. In the 6th century BCE, the low-lying valleys between the Capitoline, Palatine, and Esquiline hills were prone to flooding and accumulation of waste, conditions that hindered movement and construction. Historical records identify Tarquinius Priscus, the fifth king of Rome, as the ruler who ordered the construction of the Cloaca Maxima around 600 BCE. This initiative was not merely a feat of engineering but a foundational act that would shape the city's destiny for centuries. The earliest phase of the Cloaca Maxima was not the enclosed tunnel familiar from later descriptions, but rather an open drainage channel. Its primary purpose was to collect and direct rainwater and effluent away from the densely populated areas, particularly the marshy land near the Roman Forum and the Velabrum. Etruscan workers, renowned for their skills in hydraulic engineering, played a crucial role in this monumental task, alongside plebeians conscripted for the labor. Together, these groups undertook the difficult work of excavating trenches, shaping the route through the landscape, and laying the earliest masonry. The construction materials for the initial channel were carefully selected for durability in the damp ground. The builders used large blocks of Petra Gabina, a hard volcanic stone quarried from the region, to form the walls of the channel. This choice provided both structural integrity and resistance to the erosive effects of running water and waste. The route of the Cloaca Maxima was determined by practical necessity as well as urban ambition. It ran directly through the Forum Romanum, the heart of public life, and extended toward the Tiber River, offering a direct outlet for the water and refuse collected from the city's core. As the city grew, so too did the demands placed on its drainage system. The open channel, exposed to the elements and the detritus of urban activity, required adaptation. There are no surviving contemporaneous accounts that specify the precise motivations for enclosing the channel, but the gradual transformation from an open ditch to a covered sewer is consistent with the increasing density and complexity of the city above. By the 2nd century BCE, the process of covering the Cloaca Maxima had been completed. Large stone slabs and later arches constructed from cut stone enclosed the channel, converting it into a subterranean conduit capable of carrying not only stormwater, but also household and commercial waste. This evolution was not a single event, but a series of modifications and expansions, each reflecting the shifting needs of Rome. Archaeological evidence reveals that by the late Roman Republic, the covered sewer reached a length of approximately 1,600 meters, extending its reach deeper into the urban fabric. Contemporary observers marveled at the scale and capacity of the structure. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, described the Cloaca Maxima as large enough to allow the passage of a wagon loaded with hay. Strabo, the Greek geographer, echoed this observation, emphasizing the impressive dimensions of the tunnel and its ability to accommodate such large vehicles. Throughout its early history, the Cloaca Maxima underwent periodic repairs and structural enhancements. The archaeological record traces phases of expansion and reinforcement, particularly in response to the stresses imposed by Rome's growing population and the construction of monumental buildings above. Inscriptions and official records from the period, while sparse, occasionally reference the sewer in the context of public works and city administration. The absence of elaborate dedications or commemorative inscriptions suggests that despite its significance, the Cloaca Maxima was regarded as a utilitarian necessity rather than a monument to civic pride. By the close of the 2nd century CE, the Cloaca Maxima had matured into a complex, enclosed system, seamlessly integrated into the infrastructure of Rome. Its presence beneath the city was largely invisible, yet its influence on daily life and urban development was profound. The evolution from open channel to vaulted sewer marked a critical transformation in the relationship between Rome's inhabitants and their environment, setting the stage for centuries of reliance on this hidden artery. The maintenance of the Cloaca Maxima was an ongoing challenge that required coordination, labor, and technical expertise. Over the centuries, responsibility for the upkeep of the sewer system passed through various hands, reflecting the changing organization of Roman civic administration. During the late Republic and into the imperial era, specific officials and groups were charged with the care of Rome's public works. The aediles, magistrates responsible for the city's infrastructure, played a role in overseeing maintenance, while the labor itself fell to teams of workers skilled in masonry, excavation, and repair. A pivotal moment in the history of the Cloaca Maxima's maintenance occurred during the reign of Augustus. In 33 BCE, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a trusted friend and general of Augustus, executed extensive repairs to the system. Agrippa's intervention was not limited to superficial fixes. It involved the restoration and reinforcement of key sections, ensuring the continued functionality of the sewer as the city expanded. These repairs were part of a broader campaign to improve the city's water supply and sanitation, reflecting the priorities of Augustan administration. The physical dimensions of the Cloaca Maxima in this period were substantial. In some sections, the channel measured 4.2 meters high and 3.2 meters wide, ample space for inspectors or maintenance crews to enter and work within the tunnel. The system was not a single conduit but a network, with 8 branches emptying into the main channel. Along its route, minor capped drains connected houses, baths and workshops to the main sewer, forming a web of subterranean passageways that channeled waste efficiently toward the Tiber. Access to the interior of the Cloaca Maxima was facilitated by a series of entry points. While the precise locations of all these access points are not documented in surviving records, archaeological investigations have identified manholes and maintenance shafts along the route. These openings allowed workers to enter the sewer for inspections, to clear blockages, and to perform repairs. The presence of capped drains and vaults closed with flat panels or large rocks provided additional means for accessing specific sections as needed. The conditions faced by those who maintained the Cloaca Maxima are not detailed in contemporaneous written accounts. The absence of direct testimony leaves the routines and hazards of this labor largely unrecorded. Nevertheless, the scale of the tunnel and the complexity of its branches imply that maintenance was physically demanding and required specialized knowledge. Workers would have contended with confined spaces, darkness, and the constant flow of water and waste. A trench wall constructed within the channel served to hold back sediments, reducing the need for frequent dredging and helping to preserve the integrity of the conduit. The administrative framework supporting the maintenance of the Cloaca Maxima is evidenced by official interventions and documented repairs. The work overseen by Agrippa in 33 BCE stands as a notable example of high-level attention to the sewer's condition. In addition, the rebuilding of a portion of the Cloaca Maxima beneath the Basilica Aemilia in 34 AD, using tufa and travertine, demonstrates the ongoing commitment to maintaining and upgrading the system in response to both wear and urban development above. The tools and techniques employed in the maintenance of the Cloaca Maxima are partially revealed through archaeological findings. Stone-cutting implements, lifting devices, and materials for patching masonry have been discovered in association with the sewer and similar structures. The use of flat panels or rocks to close vaults and the construction of sediment-holding walls suggest practical solutions developed over generations to address recurring challenges. The routine nature of these efforts, the lack of elaborate commemoration, and the anonymity of most laborers underscore the largely unacknowledged but essential role these workers played in sustaining Roman urban life. The influence of the Cloaca Maxima extended far beyond its subterranean confines. Its construction and operation fundamentally shaped the layout and development of Rome itself. Prior to the creation of the sewer, the area around the Roman Forum was a landscape of marshes and periodically flooded ground, inhospitable to permanent settlement or monumental construction. The decision by Tarquinius Priscus, and later Tarquinius Superbus, to fill the velabrum with soil, gravel, and debris before constructing the Cloaca Maxima transformed this environment. The drainage provided by the sewer turned swampy land into solid ground, opening vast new spaces for building and public activity. The route of the Cloaca Maxima was not incidental, but determined by the need to channel water from the valleys between the hills and the Forum directly to the Tiber. This alignment dictated the orientation of subsequent streets and the placement of major public spaces. The canal's path through the Forum Romanum and beneath key structures such as the Basilica Aemilia provided both challenges and opportunities for Roman planners and builders. The channel crossed obliquely beneath the nave of the Basilica Aemilia, a fact that required careful coordination during construction and periodic rebuilding as the city's architecture evolved. The presence of the Cloaca Maxima facilitated the development of the Forum Romanum and the surrounding districts. With effective drainage, these areas could support the weight of large buildings, temples, and marketplaces. Archaeological evidence demonstrates the close interaction between the sewer and above-ground structures, with foundations and substructures designed to accommodate the channel's presence. The ability to manage water and waste beneath the city was a precondition for the dense urbanization that characterized Rome at its height. Legal and administrative records from this period do not provide detailed accounts of restrictions on construction above or near the Cloaca Maxima. However, the enduring utility of the sewer and the periodic need for access and repair would have necessitated some degree of coordination between builders and those responsible for the city's infrastructure. The absence of named architects or planners associated with specific decisions regarding the sewer's integration into the urban landscape highlights the collective and incremental nature of Roman urban development. The physical legacy of the Cloaca Maxima is visible in the archaeological record, where the remnants of the channel and its branches can be traced in relation to the foundations of forums, temples, and other monumental buildings. The interaction between the sewer and the structures above is a testament to the adaptability and ingenuity of Roman engineers and planners. The Cloaca Maxima was not merely a passive feature of the landscape, but an active determinant of the city's form, guiding the placement of streets, influencing the orientation of public spaces, and enabling the dense layered cityscape that defined Rome. By the 2nd century CE, the Cloaca Maxima had become an indispensable, if largely invisible, element of Rome's daily existence. Its construction had transformed the environment, its maintenance sustained the health and growth of the city, and its subterranean course shaped the very fabric of urban life. The enduring presence of its remnants beneath the modern city is a silent witness to the practical genius and organizational capacity of those who built and maintained this ancient sewer, whose legacy continues to shape Rome in ways both seen and unseen. The landscape of ancient Rome was marked by temples whose forms and functions were shaped as much by exclusion as by inclusion. From the 6th century BCE to the 4th century CE, the architecture and procedures governing access to these sacred spaces reflected a deliberate effort to separate the ordinary from the divine, the public from the privileged. The boundaries established within these religious buildings were not symbolic gestures but carefully maintained realities, enforced by physical barriers, priestly authority, and legal or ritual consequence. Roman temples, as they appeared in the city and throughout the territories under Roman influence, typically rested upon raised podiums. This elevation itself was a signal of distinction, setting the temple apart from the everyday bustle of the surrounding streets and markets. A visitor approaching a Roman temple would first encounter a frontal pronos, an entry porch marked by columns and steps. This area served as the primary public interface, where individuals could gather, make offerings, or participate in ceremonies visible from outside. Beyond this porch, however, the temple's core, the cella, stood as an enclosed chamber, distinct in both purpose and accessibility. Contemporary architectural descriptions, supported by surviving structures and archaeological reconstructions, consistently reveal this spatial distinction. The cella was not simply a larger room within a public building. It was a defined interior sanctuary, often windowless and shielded from the gaze of those outside. At Santo Mobono, archaeological work on temple foundations dating to the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE revealed interior chambers separated from the approach, underscoring the persistence of this design from Rome's early history. The threshold between pronos and cella was not merely symbolic. In documented cases, such as the Temple of Romulus in the Roman Forum, original bronze doors survive from the 4th century CE, complete with fitted hardware, demonstrating the presence of substantial operable barriers. These doors were not decorative. Their construction and placement allowed for the controlled opening and closing of the sanctuary, and they could be secured to prevent unauthorized entry. The Temple of Vesta in Rome provides another instructive example. Unlike the rectangular form of many Roman temples, the Temple of Vesta was circular, its design focused on a central hearth. The cella of this temple was entirely enclosed, with access strictly limited. Accounts from antiquity do not describe the general populace entering this space. Rather, they note the presence of barriers and procedures that kept the sanctuary distinct from the public areas outside. Even the steps and facades of temples functioned as architectural cues, marking the transition from the civic world to the sacred threshold. The separation between the exterior and the interior was thus both physical and procedural, enforced by permanent features such as doors, thresholds, and sometimes even locks or seals, as attested by the surviving bronze door mechanisms. Contemporaneous accounts provide limited but telling glimpses of what occurred within these restricted interiors. The rites performed inside the cella were typically not public spectacles. Instead, they were carried out by individuals who held specific religious authority. No evidence suggests that the general public was permitted to observe or participate directly in the rituals conducted at the innermost altars or before the cult statues housed within. The very existence of these architectural separations highlights the reality that, for most Romans, the heart of the temple, the place where the gods were believed to reside or manifest, remained unseen and inaccessible. The systems of exclusion that governed Roman temples were not left to happenstance. They were codified in the roles and responsibilities of priestly officials, whose authority over sacred spaces was both institutionalized and enforceable. Among the most prominent of these officials was the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. This individual, whose office is documented as holding principal responsibility for major public cults and properties, exercised administrative control over sites such as the Regia, the ancient headquarters of Rome's religious administration. After the period of monarchy, the Regia's ownership and operation fell explicitly under the authority of the Pontifex Maximus, strengthening the link between priestly office and spatial control. The College of Pontiffs, a collegium or priestly college, was tasked with overseeing the rituals and maintenance of many temple interiors. Their duties were not limited to ceremonial functions. They included the enforcement of boundaries and the preservation of the sanctity of restricted spaces. Inscriptions and administrative records from the period identify these colleges by name and associate them with specific temples, providing direct evidence of their involvement in managing temple access. The priest's authority was not abstract. It was exercised in daily practice, determining who could cross thresholds and who must remain outside. The Vestal Virgins, another well-documented priestly group, were uniquely authorized to enter and tend the sacred hearth inside the Temple of Vesta. Their responsibilities included performing rites within the enclosed sanctuary, highlighting the degree to which access to the most sacred areas was linked to specialized religious roles. The selection and training of the Vestals, as recorded in ancient sources, further underscore the formality of these arrangements. Only those who met stringent criteria and underwent prescribed initiation were permitted to carry out the duties inside the cella. The general populace, by contrast, had no such right or opportunity. The boundaries of priestly authority were further clarified by written records, including inscriptions and sometimes decrees that delineated which groups held responsibility for which temples. These records did not merely list names, they defined spheres of action, specifying the rituals to be performed, the maintenance to be upheld, and the spaces to be protected. The enforcement of these rules was not arbitrary. It was embedded in the institutional structure of Roman religion, with magistrates and other officials sometimes called upon to adjudicate disputes or violations. Ceremonies requiring restricted entry were documented as well. Within the inner sanctuaries, priests or designated officials performed sacrifices, made offerings, and conducted rites believed essential to the well-being of the state and the favor of the gods. These ceremonies were not open to the public. Their details, as recorded in ancient texts, often remain obscure, precisely because access was so tightly controlled. Only those granted formal authority could witness or participate, reinforcing the division between the sacred and the profane. The rules governing temple access were not mere recommendations. They were supported by systems of enforcement and, when necessary, consequence. Ancient legal and religious texts provide evidence of prescribed procedures to address violations, particularly in cases of ritual pollution, known as pollution. When unauthorized individuals entered restricted areas, the response was not left to chance. Procedures of ritual purification were required, and specific rites were performed to restore the sanctity of the temple. These acts were not optional. They were necessary to repair the breach in religious order. The severity of penalties for unauthorized entry is variably attested in the sources. In some cases, literary accounts describe temple gates being kept closed for extended periods, either for ritual reasons or as a matter of political policy. The deliberate closure of these doors was itself an act of control, reinforcing the fact that entry could be granted or denied at the discretion of religious authorities. The act of closing a temple was not merely a physical action, it was a public signal that access to the sacred was being withheld, whether for purification, mourning, or other reasons. While some legal codes and decrees from the period survive, the specifics of punishment for unauthorized entry are not always detailed. However, the requirement for ritual purification in the event of pollution is well attested. The procedures for such purification could involve exclusion from participation in religious rites, temporary removal from the community, or the performance of specific sacrifices or ceremonies to atone for the violation. The involvement of priests or magistrates in these processes is recorded, indicating that breaches of temple access were not considered minor infractions, but matters of public concern. Imperial legislation during the 4th century CE added further layers of legal consequence, particularly as the religious landscape of Rome began to change. Formal closures of pagan temples, as recorded under the reign of Theodosius I, were not only acts of religious policy, but also legal actions, enforced by edict. The cessation of public pagan rites, mandated by imperial authority, demonstrated that access to temple spaces could be restricted not only by religious officials but by the state itself. These measures were public and enforceable, reflecting the continuing significance of control over sacred spaces even as the official status of Roman religion shifted. Throughout this period, notable incidents of access violations are less commonly described in detail, but the presence of procedures and the documentation of responses attest to the seriousness with which such breaches were regarded. The roles played by priests, magistrates, and other officials in responding to violations are recorded in both legal and religious texts, underscoring the integration of religious and civic authority in the maintenance of temple boundaries. The Roman approach to temple access was thus a matter of practical enforcement, as much as religious belief. The physical architecture of the temples, the raised podiums, the imposing facades, the sturdy doors, worked in concert with the institutional authority of the priesthood and the backing of legal codes to establish and maintain boundaries. These boundaries shaped the experience of Roman religion for the vast majority of the population, for whom the inner sanctuaries remained closed, the rites within unseen, and the presence of the divine encountered only from a distance. In this world of thresholds and barriers, the exclusion from sacred spaces was a fact of daily life, not an abstraction or a metaphor. The systems that governed who could enter and who must remain outside were fixed in stone, bronze, and law. They were enacted by named individuals, priests, magistrates, and officials, whose duties included not only the performance of rituals but the protection of the spaces in which those rituals took place. The risks of breaching these boundaries were real, and the consequences, whether ritual, legal, or social, served to reinforce the separation that lay at the heart of Roman religious practice. The doors of the temples, for most Romans, remained firmly closed, their presence a constant reminder of the distance between the human and the divine. In the ancient city of Rome, a small circle of women stood apart from the rest of society, bound by solemn vows and entrusted with responsibilities that reached into the spiritual heart of the state. These were the Vestal Virgins, whose institution is traced in Roman tradition to Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome in the 7th century BCE. For centuries their selection, their duties, and the boundaries that surrounded them were carefully guarded, their silence and discretion essential to their unique role. The processes that shaped their lives were formal, public, and precise, involving a network of religious and civic authorities. The knowledge they held, and the secrecy that protected it, became a defining feature of Roman religious life from the monarchy, through the Republic, and deep into the imperial era. The path to becoming a Vestal Virgin began early, shaped by strict criteria and overseen by Rome's highest religious authority. Historical records indicate that candidates for the order were chosen from girls between the ages of 6 and 10. This age range was not arbitrary. Youth was seen as a guarantee of purity and malleability, ensuring that the chosen girls could be molded through training and ritual into the precise image required by the institution. Eligibility depended on more than age. Both parents of a candidate had to be alive at the time of selection, a requirement that underscored the family's stability and the girl's unbroken lineage. Physical and mental fitness were also essential. Only those free from defects could be considered, reflecting a broader Roman emphasis on bodily and spiritual wholeness for sacred roles. The responsibility for choosing the Vestal Virgins rested with the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. This individual, the highest authority in Roman religion, personally oversaw the selection process, which was formalized in a ceremony known as the captio. The capture was not merely a moment of public recognition, but a solemn act of religious and civic significance. The Pontifex Maximus would draw lots from the pool of eligible candidates, thus combining divine will with human oversight. The ceremony signaled a fundamental shift in the girl's life, marking her transition from the private world of family to the public and sacred domain of Vesta's service. Occasionally, the sources provide glimpses of individuals connected to these ceremonies. In 19 CE, Gaius Fonteius Agrippa offered his daughter as a candidate for the Vestals, a detail preserved in contemporary records. Domitius Pollio also presented his daughter in the same year. These instances illustrate the enduring prestige and responsibility associated with the role, as well as the continued involvement of Rome's elite families in the institution's maintenance. In this period, Tiberius, serving as Pontifex Maximus, personally selected a new Vestal, demonstrating the office's direct involvement in the process. Upon selection, the new Vestal entered a period of transition, governed by formal vows and rigorous training. The sources indicate that the newly chosen girls underwent a ceremony in which they took a vow of chastity, binding themselves to 30 years of celibate service. This vow was not merely personal, but public, witnessed by officials and in some cases the broader community. The records do not preserve the full text of these oaths, but their existence and solemnity are consistently attested by Roman authors. Training was structured and lengthy, reflecting the complexity and importance of the Vestals' duties. The first 10 years of their 30-year service were devoted to learning the rituals, responsibilities, and codes of conduct that defined the order. This period of training was carefully supervised by the Vestals Maxima, the senior-most member of the order, acting under the authority of the Pontifex Maximus. The training covered the maintenance of the sacred fire, the performance of rituals, and the protocols for interacting with both the public and other members of the religious hierarchy. The process was designed to ensure continuity, with knowledge passed from experienced Vestals to novices in a controlled and secluded environment. The institutional mechanisms that governed the selection and training of the Vestal virgins were precise and deeply embedded in Roman religious and civic life. Through formal ceremonies, strict eligibility requirements, and a structured period of training, the order maintained its standards and secrecy, preparing each new member for the unique obligations that lay ahead. Within the walls of the Atrium Vestae, the House of the Vestals, the boundaries of knowledge and duty were sharply drawn. The daily life of a Vestal virgin was defined by a set of responsibilities that were both visible and concealed, public in their ritual performance, yet shielded from the gaze of outsiders, through layers of secrecy and control. Chief among these duties was the maintenance of the eternal flame in the Temple of Vesta, a task that symbolized the continuity and security of Rome itself. The flame was never to be allowed to go out, and its care was entrusted exclusively to the Vestals, marking them as guardians of the city's spiritual well-being. The physical spaces assigned to the Vestals were carefully delineated and controlled. The Atrium Vestae, their residence, was located in the heart of the Roman Forum, close to the Temple of Vesta. The architecture of these spaces reflected their sacred function. The House of the Vestals was both home and cloister, its layout designed to provide seclusion while still allowing for the performance of ritual duties. Access to the Atrium Vestae and the inner sanctum of the temple was tightly regulated. Only the Vestals and specific religious officials, primarily the Pontifex Maximus, were permitted within certain areas. These controls were not simply practical, but served as a physical manifestation of the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, between those initiated into the mysteries of Vesta and the uninitiated public. The rituals performed by the Vestals were central to Roman religious practice, but shrouded in secrecy. While the maintenance of the sacred fire was a visible and public act, the details of many rites remained concealed from outsiders. The Vestals conducted ceremonies that were not fully described in contemporary sources, and the boundaries around these rituals were strictly maintained. The knowledge of the correct procedures, prayers, and taboos was transmitted internally, from senior Vestals to novices, during the final 10 years of service when experienced members took on the role of trainers. This internal cycle of instruction ensured that the Order's secrets remained within its walls, guarded against disclosure, even as generations passed. The movements and interactions of the Vestals were also subject to regulation. While they participated in certain public events and processions, their lives were largely centered within the confines of the Atrium Vestae and the Temple of Vesta. Their interactions with outsiders were limited, and their presence in public was often accompanied by ritual or official oversight. The Pontifex Maximus, as the institution's primary authority, was responsible for enforcing these boundaries, ensuring that the Vestals' conduct and environment conformed to the strict standards of the Order. Records from the period do not provide accounts of individuals violating or attempting to access the restricted spaces of the Vestals within the date range considered. The absence of such incidents in the surviving sources may reflect the effectiveness of the controls in place, or the discretion with which breaches were handled. What is clear from the documentation is that the boundaries around the Vestals' knowledge and activities were carefully maintained, enforced by a combination of architectural separation, ritual protocol, and institutional authority. The systems that protected Vestal secrecy were not merely passive. They were actively enforced through a hierarchy of oversight, with the Pontifex Maximus at the apex, supported by the Vestalis Maxima and the internal discipline of the Order. These mechanisms combined to create an environment in which the Vestals' unique knowledge and responsibilities were shielded from the outside world, their silence and discretion preserved as essential elements of their role. Yet the Order's secrecy and the high standards expected of its members also brought with them the possibility of severe consequences when obligations were breached. The Roman sources are explicit about the punishments imposed on Vestal virgins for failures in duty or lapses in secrecy. The Pontifex Maximus, as the chief priest and head of the religious hierarchy, held the authority to judge and discipline the Vestals. This power was both extensive and personal. For minor faults, the Vestals faced scourging at the hands of the Pontifex Maximus. Plutarch, writing within the period, described how the high priest would administer corporal punishment for lesser offenses, such as neglecting specific duties or violating the Order's codes of conduct. One particular area of vigilance was the maintenance of the sacred fire. Should a Vestal allow the flame to go out, the consequences were immediate and public. The sources record that the Vestal responsible would be stripped and beaten by the chief priest, a punishment intended to reinforce the seriousness of the obligation and the gravity of failure. This discipline was carried out without the shedding of blood, in accordance with religious taboos surrounding the sanctity of the Vestals' bodies. The records do not always preserve the names of those involved in such incidents, but the institutional procedures are clear. The Pontifex Maximus acted as both judge and executioner of discipline, sometimes in the presence of other officials or witnesses. In the documented case from 19 CE, Tiberius, serving as Pontifex Maximus, selected a new Vestal, a reminder of the office's ongoing responsibility for both the Order's composition and its discipline. The public and institutional responses to breaches of Vestal obligations were shaped by the significance of the Order's role in Roman society. The maintenance of secrecy, the performance of rituals, and the observance of vows were not seen as private matters, but as issues of state and religious security. Breaches were addressed through formal procedures, with the chief priest and at times the broader religious college involved in investigation and punishment. The process was designed both to correct the individual failing and to reaffirm the boundaries that protected the order's knowledge and sanctity. Contemporaneous accounts from witnesses or participants in these disciplinary actions are limited, reflecting the secretive nature of the proceedings and the sensitivity of the issues involved. The surviving descriptions, however, leave little doubt about the seriousness with which the Roman authorities treated breaches of vestal duty. The mechanisms of authority and discipline were integral to the maintenance of secrecy, ensuring that the trust placed in the Vestal Virgins was both protected and, when necessary, enforced through institutional power. Across the centuries from the 7th century BCE to the 4th century CE, the institution of the Vestal Virgins maintained its character as a closed and carefully guarded world. Through formal selection, rigorous training, closely regulated duties, and a system of discipline anchored in the highest religious authority, the order preserved its unique knowledge and the silence that protected it. The boundaries around the Vestals, physical, procedural, and symbolic, remained crucial to the integrity of their role, shaping their lives and their place within Roman society for generations. As dusk descended over the city of Rome between the 1st century BCE and the 4th century CE, the transformation of the urban landscape was both palpable and deliberate. The fading of sunlight brought not just a shift in atmosphere, but a carefully managed transition into a period of heightened vigilance and structured oversight. For a city as populous and complex as Rome, the hours after sunset demanded a systematic approach to safety and order, shaped by evolving institutions and administrative reforms. The organization of Rome's night watches and fire prevention systems during this era reflected a direct response to the unique risks of urban life after dark. In the earliest phase of the period, localized firefighting and night watch responsibilities fell to groups organized within neighborhoods, known as vici. Each vicus was overseen by a vicio magister, an official charged with coordinating communal efforts to address emergencies such as fires. This decentralized approach placed the burden of nighttime safety on residents and their chosen leaders, who marshaled resources and manpower from within their own districts. Prior to the institutionalization of a citywide night watch, the Tresviri Nocturni 3 magistrates bore official responsibility for nocturnal oversight. Their mandate, rooted in the late Republic, included the supervision of rudimentary fire prevention and the maintenance of public order during the night. However, the scale and complexity of Rome's urban sprawl soon outstripped the capacity of these magistrates and neighborhood groups to respond effectively to mounting hazards. The inadequacy of these arrangements became especially clear in the wake of repeated and devastating fires, which exposed the limitations of ad hoc and locally managed responses. The administrative landscape shifted dramatically in 6 CE, when Emperor Augustus established the vigils, a professional force tasked explicitly with the dual responsibilities of firefighting and maintaining order after dark. Known formally as the Vigiles Urbani or Cohortes Vigilum, this organization represented a significant evolution in Rome's approach to nighttime safety. The vigils were structured into cohorts, each assigned to patrol and protect specific sectors of the city. Their duties extended beyond extinguishing fires to apprehending thieves and pursuing runaway slaves, demonstrating the breadth of nocturnal risks that confronted urban authorities. The creation of the vigils followed a major administrative reorganization after severe fires in 7 BCE, which led Augustus to divide Rome into 14 zones, each further subdivided into approximately 265 viges. This new administrative geography provided a framework for more consistent oversight and resource allocation, allowing the vigils to deploy their efforts systematically across the city's vast and densely populated expanse. The vigils operated under the leadership of the Praefectus Vigilum, an official whose name appears regularly in administrative records as the head of the organization. The Praefectus Vigilum, coordinated the activities of the cohorts, directed responses to emergencies, and reported on the effectiveness and challenges of nighttime operations. The presence of a named, centralized authority marked a departure from the earlier reliance on dispersed and locally elected officials, embedding the management of nocturnal risks firmly within the imperial administrative apparatus. Firefighting methods employed by the vigils included the use of buckets and pumps, tools that allowed for a more organized and sustained effort to combat blazes. Historical records note the deployment of these implements in coordinated fashion, with teams of vigils working together to contain and extinguish fires before they could spread uncontrollably through the city's densely packed insulaes and winding streets. The vigils also relied on patrol routines, traversing their assigned districts in shifts to identify hazards, respond to incidents, and deter criminal activity. Before the establishment of the vigils, some wealthy private individuals maintained their own firefighting teams, reflecting both the inadequacy of public measures and the personal stakes involved in protecting property from the ever-present threat of fire. These private teams, however, lacked the scale, training, and official authority of the later imperial force, and their efforts were necessarily limited to the interests of their patrons. The routines of the vigils and their predecessors were shaped by established protocols and signals. Audible alerts, such as calls or the striking of metal, were used to summon assistance or signal the presence of danger. The organization of shifts and the coordination of reliefs between watches were managed according to set schedules, ensuring that the city was never left unattended during the vulnerable hours of darkness. While there are no surviving first-person accounts from individual members of the vigils describing their nightly experiences, administrative sources document the regularity and discipline with which the force operated, as well as the challenges they faced in responding to large-scale emergencies. Oversight of these systems rested with the Praefectus Vigilum, and in the earlier phases, with aediles who had been charged with public firefighting measures. The transition from aedile oversight to the more specialized and professionalized command of the vigils reflected the growing recognition of the need for an organized, citywide approach to nighttime safety. The administrative reforms undertaken by Augustus and his successors were driven by lessons learned from past disasters and by the imperatives of governing a city whose population and complexity demanded constant vigilance. Lighting the city after sunset was a practical concern that shaped both the daily routines of residents and the strategies employed by authorities to maintain order. Public lighting in Rome during this period relied primarily on oil lamps, which were placed along streets and in public spaces to provide a measure of illumination. These lamps, fueled by olive oil, cast a modest glow, sufficient to mark pathways and intersections, but incapable of dispelling the deep shadows that pooled in alleys and beneath arcades. In private homes, residents used smaller lamps to light their rooms and courtyards, creating islands of light in the broader darkness of the city. The distribution of public lighting was uneven, reflecting both the limitations of available technology and the priorities of urban administration. Main thoroughfares and public spaces received the greatest attention, while secondary streets and poorer districts often remained largely unlit. The effect of this patchwork illumination was to concentrate nighttime activity in better lit areas, while rendering other parts of the city more hazardous and difficult to police. The division of the night into 4 watches, each roughly 3 hours in duration, provided a framework for organizing both military and civic guard duties. This practice, rooted in Roman tradition, was maintained throughout the period and is referenced in contemporary sources. Timekeeping devices such as water clocks or clepsydrae were employed to measure the passage of night hours and to signal the changing of the watches. Hourglasses also served as timing tools for the coordination of patrols and the management of reliefs among the vigils and other night watch personnel. Regulations on movement after sunset were enforced through the presence and activity of the night watch patrols, rather than by a single codified citywide curfew. The vigils and their counterparts were empowered to question individuals found on the streets after dark, to detain those suspected of wrongdoing, and to maintain a general atmosphere of order. While there is no surviving statute establishing a universal curfew for the city, the practical effect of these patrols was to limit nocturnal movement and discourage unauthorized gatherings. Evidence from Roman administrative records and literary sources indicates that audible signals and routine changes marked the progression of the night watches. The sounding of horns, or the striking of gongs at set intervals, served not only to organize the activities of the guards, but also to remind residents of the passage of time and the expectations of nighttime conduct. The presence of patrols and the periodic sounds associated with the changing of the guard were part of the fabric of urban life after sunset, shaping the rhythms of the city and reinforcing the authority of those charged with maintaining order. The enforcement of movement limits and the maintenance of lighting were the responsibility of the vigils, and in certain contexts, military personnel assigned to urban duties. These groups operated under the oversight of the Praefectus Vigilum and other relevant authorities, who issued instructions, monitored compliance, and responded to reports of infractions or disturbances. The absence of a single comprehensive legal code governing nocturnal behavior did not prevent the development of a robust system of practical controls, grounded in the authority of the imperial administration and the routines of the city's security forces. Contemporaneous accounts from residents and officials, while limited in number, attest to the impact of these measures on daily life. The presence of patrols and the enforcement of movement restrictions created an environment in which most citizens retreated indoors after sunset, leaving the streets to those with official business or urgent needs. The interplay between public lighting, patrol routines, and informal curbs on movement shaped the nocturnal landscape, defining both the possibilities and the limitations of life in Rome after dark. Administrative concerns about the risks and challenges of nighttime in Rome are well documented in surviving records from the period. The prevalence of urban fires and the threat they posed to life and property prompted repeated interventions by imperial authorities, culminating in the creation and ongoing refinement of the vigils and their associated systems. Legal and administrative texts assign formal responsibilities for fire prevention and night policing to the aediles in the earlier part of the period, and to the vigils following their establishment by Augustus. The reorganization of the city's administrative geography in response to major fires, particularly the division into 14 zones and numerous vicia, is recorded in contemporary sources as a direct response to the need for more effective oversight and coordination. These reforms were not merely theoretical, but were implemented in response to documented incidents and patterns of hazard, as evidenced by the production of official reports, decrees, and correspondence following episodes of urban conflagration. Named officials such as the Praefectus Vigilum appear in administrative lists as bearing responsibility for assessing and directing responses to nighttime hazards. Their role included not only the immediate management of emergencies, but also the ongoing evaluation of risks and the recommendation of policy changes as circumstances evolved. The presence of these officials in the administrative record underscores the seriousness with which the imperial government regarded the challenges of managing Rome after sunset. Debates and discussions among authorities regarding the best means of managing nocturnal risks are reflected in the periodic adjustments to organizational structures and responsibilities. The transfer of oversight from aediles to the specialized force of the vigiles, the subdivision of the city into manageable districts, and the investment in equipment and training for firefighting all point to an ongoing process of assessment and adaptation. Administrative measures implemented in response to documented concerns included the establishment of regular patrols, the maintenance of equipment depots, the appointment of responsible officials, and the promulgation of guidelines for the conduct of night watches. Contemporaneous sources include references to the effectiveness and limitations of these policies, though the voices of ordinary residents are less commonly preserved than those of officials. Surviving records indicate that while the systems in place were often effective in containing routine hazards, major incidents continued to test the capacity of the authorities and to prompt further reforms. In sum, the nocturnal transformation of Rome between the 1st century BCE and the 4th century CE was shaped by a complex interplay of institutional innovation, administrative oversight, and practical adaptation. The creation of the vigils, the division of the night into organized watches, the management of lighting and movement, and the ongoing response to documented hazards all contributed to a city that, while changed after sunset, remained under the watchful eye of those charged with its safety. The systems and actors responsible for maintaining order and addressing risk at night were not only products of their time, but also enduring features of Rome's urban identity during this pivotal era. Within the city of Rome, the preservation and control of written records took on forms that were both practical. The physical settings in which Rome's public records were stored reflected a deliberate effort to protect, restrict, and sometimes to display the written foundations of law and administration. Among the most notable of these settings was the tabularium, constructed in 87 BCE at the edge of the Forum Romanum. The tabularium was designed as an archive building, a monumental structure whose stone halls and secure rooms signaled the importance of the records kept within. Its prominent placement above the Forum underscored the connection between record-keeping and the authority of the Roman state, while its restricted interior was meant to shield documents from tampering or loss. This architectural solution was not unique in Rome. Temples throughout the city served as repositories for public records, leveraging their sacred status to provide a layer of spiritual as well as physical protection. The sanctity of these buildings, watched over by priests and subject to religious taboos, made them natural strongholds for documents whose preservation was a matter of public trust. Within their walls, laws, treaties, and contracts could be stored on shelves or in locked chests, their access limited to those with official sanction. The choice of temples as archives also reflected a wider Roman tendency to anchor civic memory in sacred space, intertwining the authority of the state with the enduring presence of the gods. The physical forms of Roman public records were as varied as the institutions that produced them. Stone and bronze inscriptions were used for laws and decrees intended for permanent public display. These inscriptions, set up in fora and along major roads, presented the text of new statutes or official acts in a format that was both durable and accessible to anyone who could read. For records that required more flexible handling, or that were not intended for broad dissemination, wooden and metal tablets were common. These tablets could be inscribed with styluses, sealed to prevent tampering, and stored in locked containers. Papyrus scrolls, meanwhile, served as the medium for correspondence, contracts, and administrative records that circulated within the bureaucracy or were filed for future reference. During the early imperial period, the Palatine Palace became a center of power, not only in a political sense, but also as a site of archival control. Emperors maintained their own personal archives within the palace, a practice that centralized authority over state documents and placed the most sensitive records under direct imperial supervision. The existence of these palace archives reflected an evolution in record-keeping, as the documentation of imperial edicts, correspondence, and administrative decisions became a tool for exercising and legitimizing power at the highest levels of government. Outside of Rome itself, the management of public records followed similar principles, though adapted to the needs of provincial administration. In Roman Egypt, for example, evidence survives of centralized public archives organized and maintained by provincial officials. These archives served as repositories for tax registers, legal decrees, and petitions, all of which were essential to the operation of the provincial bureaucracy. The physical security of these archives was ensured by their location within official buildings, the presence of administrative staff, and the use of seals and locked containers. Security measures to restrict access to public records were a consistent feature of Roman archival practice. The use of official seals, applied in wax or metal, authenticated documents, and prevented unauthorized alteration or viewing. Locked chests and rooms, overseen by designated custodians, provided further layers of protection. While some records, such as laws inscribed in stone, were intended for public consultation, the majority of documents remained behind closed doors, accessible only to those with official business or recognized authority. Responsibility for maintaining and storing public records fell to a range of offices and officials, each with defined roles and jurisdictions. In Rome, magistrates such as consuls and praetors were charged with producing and preserving official acts and edicts. The aedileship and other municipal magistracies handled public notices and the management of records related to city administration. In the provinces, administrative offices, staffed by scribes and registrars, maintained archives that supported the functions of taxation, legal adjudication, and governance. Despite the presence of official custodians, the identities of individual archivists are rarely preserved in the surviving sources. The system emphasized the continuity and reliability of office, rather than the prominence of particular persons. The public's ability to view or consult records was, as a result, mediated through these offices. While inscriptions in public spaces provided some access to laws and decrees, the great bulk of administrative records remained out of direct reach for most citizens. The doors to the archives, whether in the tabularium, a temple, or a provincial office, were not open to all who wished to enter. The authority to access and copy official records was, by design, tightly controlled. Magistrates such as consuls and praetors, empowered by their office, could produce and preserve records as part of their official duties. These magistrates were responsible for the drafting, authentication, and storage of edicts, laws, and judicial decisions. In the municipal context, aediles and other city officials managed public notices and the custody of documents related to urban affairs. The Roman administrative apparatus relied on a cadre of scribes and clerks, especially within the cursus publicus and provincial bureaucracies, to carry out the practical work of copying and managing documents. These individuals, though often unnamed in the sources, were essential to the functioning of the state. Their work ensured that records could be reproduced for administrative use, transmitted to other officials, or entered into archival registers for future consultation. In Roman Egypt, for example, legal and administrative procedures required the submission of documents to provincial registries and archives, where they were logged, copied, and stored under official supervision. Procedures for accessing and reproducing restricted documents were formalized through the use of seals and written protocols. Documents destined for official use were authenticated with seals, often bearing the mark of the issuing magistrate or office. The breaking of a seal without authorization constituted a serious offense, as it undermined the integrity of the record and the authority of the state. Access to archives was typically granted only to those with recognized legal or administrative business, and the process of copying or disseminating information from official records was subject to oversight by the appropriate magistrates or registrars. Disputes over entries in public records, or the interpretation of legal texts, were not uncommon. Contemporary sources record cases brought before magistrates and courts, in which the accuracy or authenticity of a document was questioned. In such instances, the authority of the archive and the procedures for accessing and verifying records became matters of legal significance. The presence of official seals and the testimony of custodians could be decisive in resolving these disputes. Penalties for unauthorized access or copying are not extensively documented, but the use of seals and the restricted nature of archives suggest that violations were treated as serious breaches of public trust. The control of documents was, in effect, a form of control over information and legal process. Contemporary accounts mention the process of copying and disseminating official information, particularly in the context of administrative correspondence and provincial governance, but the boundaries of access were maintained through a combination of formal procedures and institutional oversight. The restricted nature of Roman archives had profound effects on the distribution of legal power and the ability of citizens to engage with the law. Most Romans lived under a body of laws and decrees that existed primarily in official registers, rather than as texts distributed for individual consultation. The daily experience of law was mediated by magistrates, officials, and the occasional public inscription, rather than by direct access to the written word. The process of legal contestation or defense, therefore, often depended on the willingness and ability of officials to produce or interpret the relevant records. In the provinces, the control of archives by administrators determined which petitions, tax records, and legal acts were preserved and available for use. The maintenance of these archives shaped the outcomes of disputes over property, taxation, and civic status, as only those documents that had been properly registered and preserved could serve as evidence in court or before the authorities. Surviving papyri and archive registers from Roman Egypt illustrate the degree to which access to records was mediated through provincial officials, who acted as gatekeepers of legal memory and administrative continuity. The public display of laws and decrees on stone or bronze was one method by which Roman authorities sought to make legal texts accessible, but such displays covered only a fraction of the total body of law and administrative regulation. For most matters, sealed tablets and stamped documents served as the authoritative record, their authenticity guaranteed by physical marks and restricted custody. The presence of these seals, and the procedures for accessing the underlying text, reinforced the exclusivity of legal knowledge and the centralization of authority within official channels. The influence of restricted records on legal proceedings is evident in the references to official registers and written documents as evidence in court. Legal procedures often required the production of specific records to substantiate claims, and the ability to access or produce these documents could determine the outcome of a case. The authority of the archive, embodied in the physical security of the records and the legitimacy conferred by seals and official custody, was a central feature of Roman legal practice. Contemporaneous commentary on the fairness or exclusivity of record access is limited, but the very structure of Roman administration implies a system in which knowledge was powerfully mediated by office and institution. The enduring authority of sealed tablets and closed doors shaped not only the conduct of government, but also the boundaries of public knowledge and participation. In the city's administrative life, the locked archive was both a symbol and a mechanism of control, preserving the memory of law even as it restricted its direct encounter by the majority of the population. Through these systems of location, format, and official custody, the Roman state constructed a world in which information itself became a resource to be guarded, managed, and dispensed according to the needs of authority. The physical and procedural barriers that surrounded public records thus played a decisive role in defining who could know, who could act, and who could challenge the workings of Roman power. The legacy of these practices endured in the city's daily life, shaping the rhythms of administration and the limits of civic participation for centuries. Across the centuries stretching from the final decades of the Roman Republic into the height of the imperial era, the city of Rome experienced a transformation marked by unprecedented population growth and urban density. By the 1st century BCE, the demand for housing had begun to outpace the supply of traditional domus, leading to the proliferation of insulae multi-story apartment blocks that would come to dominate the cityscape. The construction of these insulae, their materials, and the regulation of their height and placement within the urban fabric became central concerns for both the authorities and residents of Rome. The technical and regulatory framework that emerged during this period reveals a landscape shaped by practical constraints, economic pressures, and evolving legal oversight, all of which contributed to the distinctive and often precarious reality of Roman urban living. The insulae of Rome were primarily constructed using a combination of brick-faced concrete and timber, a method that reflected both the technological advancements and the economic imperatives of the era. The use of concrete, particularly the Roman opus caementitium, allowed builders to erect taller and more capacious structures than had been possible with earlier techniques. Brick facings provided a durable exterior, but timber elements were frequently employed for internal floors, beams, and sometimes even for structural infill. The choice of materials was often dictated by considerations of cost and speed. Timber was less expensive and more readily available than stone or high-quality brick, and its use enabled rapid construction to meet the pressing demand for accommodation. Literary and archaeological evidence confirms that cheaper materials were commonly substituted in place of more robust options, with timber infill and lighter construction methods appearing as cost-saving measures throughout the period. The physical form of the insula was shaped not only by material concerns, but also by the need to maximize habitable space within the dense urban blocks of Rome. Surviving sources describe the insulae as occupying tightly packed city blocks, with narrow spacing between buildings and little regard for open areas or wide streets. The effect was a cityscape of towering contiguous structures, each vying for sunlight and air in the crowded quarters of the city. The density of these developments contributed to the challenges of both constructing and regulating the insulae, as well as to the hazards that would come to define life for many of their inhabitants. In response to the growing height and density of urban buildings, Roman authorities introduced legal limits on the maximum allowable height of insulae. During the reign of Augustus, a height limit of approximately 68 to 70 Roman feet, about 20.7 to 21 meters, was imposed, reflecting a concern for the structural integrity and safety of the burgeoning apartment blocks. This measure was intended to curb the construction of excessively tall and potentially unstable buildings, yet evidence suggests that builders sometimes exceeded these limits, with some insulae reportedly reaching as high as 9 stories. The persistence of such tall structures, despite legal restrictions, points to both the economic incentives driving builders and the limitations of regulatory enforcement. The Great Fire of Rome in AD 64 prompted a renewed focus on building regulations, particularly regarding construction materials and height. In the aftermath of the disaster, Emperor Nero issued new edicts, reducing the maximum permitted building height to about 60 Roman feet, approximately 17.75 to 18 meters. These measures also addressed the use of timber in construction, reflecting official recognition of the risks associated with flammable materials in such a densely built environment. The enforcement of these regulations was entrusted to the Collegia of Aediles municipal magistrates responsible for urban oversight, and to various imperial building authorities. These officials were charged with inspecting new construction, ensuring compliance with legal standards, and intervening in cases of evident danger or violation. Despite the existence of these regulatory frameworks, records do not identify specific builders, architects, or property owners as being consistently held accountable for violations of construction standards. While some prominent individuals, such as Marcus Licinius Crassus, are known to have owned multiple insulae, the surviving sources do not provide detailed accounts of their involvement in construction practices or regulatory breaches. Instead, the evidence points to a system in which economic pressures, the complexity of urban development, and the limitations of administrative oversight combine to produce a built environment marked by both ambition and risk. The shortcuts and cost-saving measures documented in literary and archaeological sources, such as the use of cheaper materials and the construction of buildings exceeding legal height limits, underscore the persistent tension between regulatory ideals and practical realities in the fast-growing city. The technical and regulatory framework of insulae construction in Rome thus emerges as a dynamic interplay of material innovation, economic necessity, and evolving legal oversight. The widespread use of brick-faced concrete and timber, the imposition and periodic revision of height limits, the dense clustering of buildings, and the role of municipal and imperial authorities in regulation all shape the distinctive character of Roman apartment life. Yet these same factors also contributed to a built environment, in which instability and hazard were ever-present features, setting the stage for the documented risks and failures that would come to define the Insulae Problem. Within this landscape of rapid construction and variable oversight, the insulae of Rome became sites of recurrent disaster. Contemporary literary sources record multiple incidents of insular collapse and fire throughout the period from the 1st century BCE to the 3rd century CE, underscoring the hazards inherent in the city's housing stock. The prevalence of fires, in particular, was a constant threat in the densely packed quarters of Rome, where timber construction and narrow streets facilitated the rapid spread of flames. The most catastrophic of these events, the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, devastated large portions of the city and prompted significant official responses concerning rebuilding and the regulation of timber use in new construction. Accounts from ancient authors and legal texts document not only the occurrence of such disasters, but also the complaints and concerns voiced by residents and neighbors regarding the safety of insulae. Contemporary sources describe the upper floors of these buildings as less desirable places to live, owing to the increased risk of collapse and fire. The fear of disaster was not confined to the poorest residents. Public reaction and criticism followed notable failures, as ancient commentaries attest. Complaints about the frequency of such incidents appear in both literary and legal sources, reflecting a widespread awareness of the dangers posed by the insulae. The response of the authorities to these disasters varied. After the Great Fire of Rome, official edicts addressed the need for safer construction practices, particularly in relation to the use of timber and the height of buildings. Reconstruction orders and penalties were issued in the wake of major fires, indicating an official recognition of the need for improved safety standards. However, the surviving records do not consistently identify named victims, witnesses, or officials associated with every disaster. While some prominent individuals are recorded as owners of multiple insulae, the details of their involvement in specific incidents or responses are largely absent from the historical record. The aftermath of insular failures was often marked by public criticism and calls for reform. Ancient commentaries describe the reaction of the populace to the destruction of property and loss of life, with expressions of concern about the adequacy of existing regulations and the willingness of authorities to enforce them. These accounts provide insight into the lived reality of instability for much of the city's population, for whom the threat of fire or collapse was an accepted part of urban existence. The sense of vulnerability was heightened by the knowledge that the upper floors of Insulae, where the poorest residents typically lived, were most at risk in the event of disaster. Direct quotations from the period express skepticism about the safety of insulae and the effectiveness of official oversight. Some ancient authors criticized the apparent tolerance of authorities for dangerous building practices, while others noted the reluctance of property owners to invest in more durable and expensive construction. The persistence of complaints and the recurrence of disasters attest to the chronic nature of these problems, as well as to the limits of official intervention in the face of economic and demographic pressures. The documented risks and public awareness of insular failures thus emerge as defining features of Roman urban life during this period. The frequency of fires and collapses, the complaints and criticisms recorded in contemporary sources, and the variable official responses all point to a city in which structural insecurity was both a practical reality and a subject of ongoing public concern. The legal framework governing insulae construction, maintenance, and safety was articulated through a series of imperial legislations and edicts, most notably those promulgated under Augustus and Nero. These measures established maximum building heights, regulated the use of flammable materials, and set out the responsibilities of municipal magistrates and imperial administrators for the oversight of urban construction. The aediles, as municipal magistrates, were charged with enforcing building regulations, inspecting new construction, and intervening in cases of evident danger or violation. Imperial administrators played a complementary role, particularly in the aftermath of major disasters, such as the Great Fire of Rome. Despite the existence of these legal frameworks, the enforcement of building regulations in Rome was uneven across neighborhoods and over time. Surviving records indicate that penalties and reconstruction orders were issued following major fires, but the practical application of these measures varied considerably. Some districts saw more rigorous enforcement, while others experienced lax oversight or selective intervention. The reasons for this unevenness are not always clear, but they likely reflect a combination of administrative limitations, local economic interests, and the complexity of managing a vast and rapidly growing city. The records do not provide exhaustive lists of prosecuted individual builders or property owners for insular violations, suggesting that prosecution was selective rather than systematic. While some penalties and reconstruction orders are documented, the absence of detailed accounts of individual cases points to the limitations of the regulatory apparatus. The effectiveness of enforcement was further constrained by the sheer scale of urban development and the persistent demand for cheap housing. Observations recorded in administrative and literary sources highlight both the achievements and the shortcomings of the regulatory system, with frequent references to the persistence of dangerous and substandard buildings despite official efforts to impose order. The limitations of regulatory enforcement are further underscored by the continued prevalence of cost-saving construction practices and the persistence of buildings that exceeded legal height limits. The willingness of builders and property owners to circumvent regulations, combined with the challenges faced by municipal and imperial officials in monitoring and enforcing compliance, contributed to a built environment characterized by both innovation and risk. The reality of legal regulation and its inconsistent application to insula is thus clearly established by the surviving evidence, which reveals a complex interplay of law, administration, and practical necessity in the management of Rome's housing stock. Through the detailed examination of construction methods, incidents of failure, and the legal context of insulae regulation, it becomes evident that structural insecurity was not merely an occasional problem, but an accepted and persistent feature of urban life in Rome between the 1st century BCE and the 3rd century CE. The technical innovations that enabled the rapid expansion of the city also introduced new hazards, while the legal and administrative frameworks designed to mitigate these risks were limited in their effectiveness. The lived reality for much of Rome's population was one of daily negotiation with the dangers of collapse and fire, a reality shaped by the interplay of economic imperatives, regulatory ideals, and the practical constraints of urban growth. In this environment, the Insulae Problem became a defining aspect of the Roman urban experience, embodying both the achievements and the vulnerabilities of the ancient metropolis. Amid the crowded streets and bustling forums of ancient Rome, the practice of detention unfolded quietly, away from the city's lively public spaces. From the 5th century BCE through the 3rd century CE, the architecture and administration of Roman holding spaces reflected a deliberate preference for discretion and impermanence. Roman imprisonment was not intended as an enduring punishment, but as a temporary, largely invisible measure, closely tied to the machinery of political and judicial authority. Within the city's administrative heart, holding cells and underground chambers provided brief and hidden confinement, preserving the efficiency and order valued by Roman governance. The most prominent and enduring site of detention in Rome during this period was the Carcer Tullianum, often simply referred to as the Tullianum. This structure occupied a significant position in the urban landscape, situated in the Comitium on the northeastern slope of the Capitoline Hill. Its proximity to the Curia, where the Senate met, and the Forum Romanum, the center of political and commercial activity, underscored its role as an instrument of state authority. The Tullianum's location was not isolated or peripheral. Instead, it was embedded within the heart of Rome's administrative and judicial world, flanked by the tabularium, which housed official records, and the steep Gemonian stairs. Architecturally, the Tullianum consisted of two main chambers, each serving distinct but related purposes in the process of detention. The upper chamber was accessible from street level, but the lower dungeon was sunk deep into the earth, about 12 feet below ground, according to the historian Sallust. Entry to this subterranean cell was gained not through a grand portal, but through a small, unobtrusive door set in the floor of the upper room. Stone walls enclosed the space, and a vaulted ceiling arched overhead, creating an atmosphere described by ancient observers as oppressive and gloomy. A drain in the lower chamber connected to the Cloaca Maxima, the city's great sewer, further emphasizing its hidden functional character. Other holding spaces in Rome similarly prioritized discretion. The Lautumae, a set of stone quarries repurposed for confinement, were located west of the Curia Hostilia, between the Capitoline and Quirinal hills. These spaces, like the Tullianum, were not designed for comfort or prolonged habitation. Instead, their construction and placement reflected the Roman desire to keep detention out of public view and closely linked to centers of authority. The Lautumae lacked the monumental facades of temples or public baths. Their entrances were often inconspicuous, blending into the city's dense architectural fabric. Archaeological remains and literary accounts offer glimpses into the physical realities of these detention areas, though much remains obscured by the passage of time. The Tullianum's stone construction and subterranean design have persisted, allowing modern observers to trace its outlines. Ancient descriptions, such as those provided by Sallust, emphasize the chamber's depth, darkness, and the sense of isolation it imposed on those confined within. Access to these spaces was tightly controlled, with entry often limited to officials, guards, and the condemned. The small entryways and underground passages ensured that the movement of detainees remained largely invisible to the broader population. The absence of grand entrances or decorative features further reinforced the intent to conceal, rather than to display the process of confinement. Responsibility for maintaining and overseeing these holding spaces fell to specific officials within the Roman administrative system. The Trisviri Capitales, a board of 3 magistrates, were charged with the supervision of prisons and the execution of sentences. Their office, established around 290 to 287 BCE, operated under the authority of the urban praetor, who held broad judicial powers within the city. The Trisviri Capitales administered the guards assigned to these detention areas, ensuring that prisoners remained securely confined until their fate was determined by judicial or executive order. The physical maintenance of holding spaces was also a matter of official concern. For example, the travertine wall of the Carcer was restored by the suffect consuls Rufinus and Nerva in the early 1st century CE, reflecting ongoing attention to the integrity and security of the structure. Contemporaneous accounts from detainees, guards, or officials provide only limited insight into the daily conditions or atmosphere within these spaces. The surviving sources, largely written by external observers or later historians, focus on the physical characteristics of the Tullianum and its role in the administration of justice. The emphasis on stone walls, vaulted ceilings, and subterranean gloom conveys a sense of severity and isolation, but detailed descriptions of daily routines or personal experiences are largely absent. The administrative and architectural features of these spaces thus emerge more clearly than the human stories that unfolded within them. Within this hidden architecture, the purpose and duration of Roman confinement were sharply defined. Detention was not conceived as a punishment in its own right, but as a brief transitional measure. Inmates in the Carcer Tullianum rarely stayed for extended periods. Their presence marked a pause between accusation and judgment, or between sentencing and execution. The Tullianum served as a holding place for those awaiting trial, for individuals condemned to death, or for persons whose fate required further deliberation by political authorities. The use of the carcer for temporary detention is documented throughout the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, establishing a pattern that persisted across generations. The most notable episodes recorded in detail by ancient historians underscore the brevity and finality associated with confinement. In 63 BCE, the Catilinarian conspirators were detained in the Tullianum before being strangled on the orders of the consul. Jugurtha, the captured king of Numidia, was starved to death in the carcer in 104 BCE. Vercingetorix, the defeated Gallic leader, was beheaded there in 49 BCE. Each case illustrates the carcer's function as a temporary measure, a place where the condemned awaited execution rather than serving a prolonged sentence. The legal and administrative purposes for which individuals were detained were closely tied to the machinery of Roman justice and political control. Detention served as a prelude to trial or execution, a means of ensuring that the accused or condemned remained within reach of the authorities. There is little evidence to suggest that Roman holding spaces were regularly used for protective custody or as a means of shielding individuals from external threats. The distinction between pre-trial, punitive, and protective detention, so prominent in later legal systems, is not clearly articulated in surviving Roman sources from this period. Instead, the focus rests on the swift movement from accusation to resolution, with detention serving as a brief interval in the process. Procedures for release, transfer, or further punishment following confinement are primarily documented through the outcomes of notable cases. Upon judgment, detainees might be executed within the carcer, as in the cases of the Catilinarian conspirators and Vercingetorix, or transferred elsewhere if the sentence required it. The decision to release or punish those held in temporary confinement rested with magistrates empowered to interpret and enforce the law. Named officials, including consuls, praetors, and the Tresviri Capitales, appear in historical records as the primary agents responsible for determining the fate of detainees. The actions of these authorities, rather than any fixed duration of confinement, shaped the experience of those held in Roman detention. Contemporaneous accounts offer little evidence of widespread public awareness or debate regarding the use of temporary confinement. The location and design of holding spaces, concealed within the administrative core of the city, limited opportunities for public observation or intervention. The process of detention unfolded behind stone walls and beneath the surface of Rome's political life, reinforcing the impression of a system designed for efficiency and discretion, rather than spectacle or deterrence. While the execution of prominent figures might draw public attention, the act of confinement itself remained largely hidden from view. The administrative framework supporting Roman detention was characterized by clearly defined roles and procedures. The Tresviri Capitales, as the principal officers responsible for the custody and management of detainees, operated under the supervision of the urban praetor. Their duties extended to overseeing the guards stationed within the carcer and other holding spaces, maintaining security, and ensuring that sentences were carried out as ordered. The capitales were also responsible for the practical aspects of prison administration, including the maintenance and repair of the physical structures. The restoration of the carcer's travertine wall by Rufinus and Nerva serves as evidence of ongoing official oversight and investment in the integrity of detention facilities. Procedures for recording, monitoring, or transferring detainees are not extensively detailed in surviving records from this period. The absence of systematic documentation or regulation concerning the treatment or rights of those held in temporary confinement reflects the transitional and discretionary nature of Roman detention. The focus of administrative oversight was on security and the execution of judicial decisions, rather than on the establishment of formal rights or protections for detainees. Interactions between detainees and administrative personnel, when described, are filtered through the lens of high-profile cases and political crises. The execution of the Catalanarian conspirators, for example, is recounted primarily in terms of the orders issued by the consul and the actions of the guards who carried out the sentence. The role of the Tresviri Capitales and their subordinates is presented as one of efficient, impersonal enforcement, rather than of negotiation or mediation. Named individuals associated with notable cases, consuls, praetors, and the capitales, are recorded in connection with decisions about detention and execution, highlighting the centrality of official authority in the process. Contemporaneous sources do not describe formal mechanisms for accountability or oversight of those managing holding spaces. The system relied on the authority of magistrates and the expectation of obedience to legal and executive orders. The absence of explicit regulations or review procedures reflects the broader Roman preference for efficiency and order over transparency or procedural safeguards. The discretion exercised by officials in the administration of detention underscores the hidden and temporary character of Roman confinement. From the 5th century BCE through the 3rd century CE, the practice of detention in Rome remained closely intertwined with the city's political and administrative life. Holding spaces such as the Casa Tullianum and the Lautamie were positioned at the heart of the city, their architecture and management reflecting a commitment to discretion and impermanence. Detention served as a brief transitional measure, administered by officials whose authority derived from their place within the Roman legal system. The physical and administrative landscape of Roman holding spaces thus emerges as one of quiet efficiency, shaped by the desire to keep confinement out of sight and closely tied to the mechanisms of state power. In this world of stone walls, underground chambers, and silent corridors, the reality of Roman detention was hidden from view, a fleeting interval in the larger machinery of justice and governance. In the vast expanse of the Roman world, from the closing decades of the Republic to the complex hierarchies of the later empire, legal knowledge remained a guarded preserve. The intricacies of law, its interpretation, and its application were not matters of common understanding, but rather the domain of a specialized elite. Roman jurists, emerging as a distinct professional group by the 3rd century BCE, formed the intellectual backbone of this system. Their training, rooted in the study of foundational texts such as the 12 Tables, equipped them to navigate a landscape where law was both an instrument of order and a tool of governance. The 12 Tables themselves, produced in 449 or 450 BCE, persisted as a reference point for centuries, their provisions cited and debated by generations of legal minds. Yet these laws were not broadly disseminated. Instead, their substance and significance filtered through the pens and voices of jurists, who developed a tradition of written legal opinions responsa that would become authoritative resources for magistrates and officials. Access to this legal knowledge was sharply limited. There is no record from this period of formal institutions, open to the general populace, dedicated to the teaching or transmission of law. The education of jurists occurred within tightly controlled circles, often through private mentorship, familial connections, or apprenticeship to established legal experts. The language of the law itself, dense with technical terms and procedural formulas, posed a further barrier. Ordinary citizens, lacking specialized training and excluded from the networks of legal scholarship, found themselves dependent on the expertise of others when confronted with the machinery of justice. The mechanisms of preservation and transmission of legal knowledge were similarly exclusive. Legal texts, whether the foundational 12 Tables, later statutes, or the accumulating body of Praetorian edicts, were physically stored in official archives, temples, or the private libraries of jurists. These documents were not intended for casual consultation. Instead, their custody and interpretation remained the prerogative of magistrates and legal experts. The office of the praetor, central to the judicial life of Rome, issued edicts, edicta, that were posted publicly during a praetor's term, but the practical comprehension and application of these edicts depended on specialized knowledge. Over time, especially by the late Republic and early Empire, the proliferation of legal writings and formulas resulted in a vast and scattered record, further impeding access for those outside the professional legal class. By the early 2nd century CE, efforts to impose order on this growing complexity gained imperial impetus. The Emperor Hadrian commissioned the jurist Salvius Julianus to reorganize and consolidate the Praetorian edicts, resulting in the Edictum Perpetuum. This comprehensive and unalterable edict, which could only be changed by the emperor, exemplified both the centralization of legal authority and the continuing restriction of legal knowledge. The Edictum Perpetuum was not a popular manual, but a technical document, its usage and interpretation reserved for those with the requisite expertise. Simultaneously, the scholarly writings of the classical jurists, whose names and works are documented in legal history, became the intellectual core of Roman legal science. Their treatises and commentaries, produced during the first 2.5 centuries CE, formed a corpus studied and cited by officials but remained inaccessible to the majority of Roman citizens. Public attitudes toward this system of legal expertise and secrecy are not extensively documented in contemporaneous sources. Surviving records do not offer widespread commentary from ordinary citizens on the fairness or openness of legal knowledge. Instead, the evidence points to a quiet acceptance, or at least resignation, to the realities of a system where the law was both present and distant, a body of rules that shaped daily life, but was not meant to be fully seen or understood by those outside the corridors of power. Within this framework of restricted knowledge, the interpretation and application of law depended heavily on magistrates and officials. The Roman magistrate, whether a praetor, consul, or provincial governor, held the authority to determine judicial remedies and to shape the form those remedies would take in court. This power was not exercised in a vacuum. Magistrates consulted the responsa of jurists, whose formal opinions provided guidance on points of law, and drew upon the accumulated wisdom of edicts and statutes. However, the ultimate discretion rested with the magistrate, especially under the formulary system that prevailed from the late Republic into the classical period. The formulary system itself was a hallmark of Roman procedural innovation. In this system, the magistrate prepared a written formula that defined the issues to be decided by the judex, a lay judge or panel appointed to resolve the case. The formula set the boundaries of the legal dispute, specifying the facts to be established and the remedies available. The magistrate's role was pivotal. He decided not only the content of the formula, but also whether a case would proceed to judgment. This discretion allowed for significant variation in the application of law from one case to another, depending on the magistrate's interpretation and priorities. Jurists played a crucial supporting role in this process. Their responsa, solicited by both magistrates and private individuals, provided authoritative interpretations of statutes, edicts, and legal principles. These written opinions were collected, studied, and sometimes cited in court, contributing to the evolving body of Roman law. The collaboration between magistrates and jurists is well documented in legal sources from the period, with individual jurists, such as Salvius Julianus, in the early 2nd century CE, entrusted with major projects of legal consolidation and reform. At the provincial level, governors exercised similar authority, issuing legal decisions and edicts that adapted Roman norms to local conditions. The emperor, as the apex of legal authority, issued constitutions, instructions to subordinates, and judicial decisions in his capacity as judge. These acts became increasingly important as sources of law, especially from the middle of the 2nd century CE onward, further concentrating interpretive power in the hands of a select few. The transparency of legal proceedings in this system was limited. While some edicts and decisions were posted or proclaimed publicly, the reasoning behind judicial interpretations, the content of juristic responsa, and the deliberations of magistrates were not routinely disclosed to the wider public. The process by which legal questions were resolved remained largely within the domain of officials and experts. Records describing notable disputes or variations in legal interpretation among magistrates exist, reflecting the inherent flexibility and sometimes inconsistency of the system, but these records themselves were products of elite legal culture, not instruments of public accountability. The consequences of this system, its opacity, its reliance on discretionary authority, and its exclusion of ordinary citizens from legal understanding, were profound. The rapid growth and scattering of Praetorian edicts and juristic writings, especially by the late Republic and early Empire, created a legal environment that could be bewildering even for those within the legal profession. For those outside it, the law was often experienced as a distant and inaccessible force. The consolidation efforts of Hadrian, culminating in the Edictum Perpetuum, aimed to impose order and predictability, but also reinforced the centralization of knowledge and authority. The concentration of legal expertise in the hands of jurists and magistrates is a documented feature of Roman legal practice from the 2nd century BCE onward. This concentration had tangible effects on the administration of justice. Magistrates, exercising broad discretionary power under the jus honorarium, could provide or refuse judicial remedies based on their interpretation of the law. The fusion of civil law, jus civil, which applied exclusively to Roman citizens, and Praetorian law, jus honorarium, which reflected the magistrates' edicts, produced a system that was both adaptive and ambiguous. Instances where legal ambiguity affected individuals or groups are recorded in the legal literature of the period. The technical nature of legal language, the proliferation of overlapping edicts and statutes, and the discretionary authority of magistrates created opportunities for confusion and exploitation. Disputes sometimes arose over the interpretation of procedural formulas, or the applicability of particular edicts, with outcomes dependent on the skill and influence of the advocates involved. However, the system's opacity often meant that such disputes were resolved within the confines of official proceedings, without broader public scrutiny. Contemporaneous commentary on the fairness or accessibility of the legal system is limited. Surviving sources, produced primarily by jurists and officials, tend to focus on the technical merits of legal procedures, rather than on their social consequences. There is little evidence of systematic efforts to clarify or reform opaque legal practices for the benefit of ordinary citizens during this period. Instead, legal evolution proceeded through gradual adjustments in procedure and the accumulation of authoritative opinions, rather than through initiatives aimed at democratizing legal knowledge. The influence of legal opacity extended beyond the courtroom. Social and political relationships were shaped by the ability or inability to navigate the complexities of Roman law. Individuals with access to jurists, magistrates, or imperial officials were better positioned to secure favorable outcomes, while those without such connections faced significant disadvantages. The legal system thus reinforced existing hierarchies, providing tools for the powerful to assert and defend their interests. Documented cases from the period highlight both the empowerment of legal experts and the vulnerability of those outside their ranks. The names of prominent jurists and magistrates appear in legal sources as arbiters of complex disputes, while the experiences of ordinary litigants are often recorded only in passing, if at all. The system's design, with its reliance on specialized knowledge and discretionary authority, ensured that the gap between written law and lived experience remained wide. By the end of the period covered, the dominance of imperial edicts and constitutions, as forms of legal authority underscored the centralization and inaccessibility of legal knowledge. The evolution of procedure, from legis actions to the formulary system, and eventually to cognitia extraordinaria, reflected ongoing efforts to manage the complexity and scale of imperial administration. Yet these changes did not fundamentally alter the exclusive character of Roman legal expertise. The law remained a body of knowledge, not meant to be seen by all, but rather interpreted and enforced by those entrusted with its secrets. In sum, the Roman legal system from the 2nd century BCE to the 4th century CE was defined by the specialization and restriction of legal knowledge. Jurists, magistrates and officials occupied privileged positions as interpreters and custodians of the law, their authority reinforced by the technical complexity and voluminous nature of legal texts. Ordinary citizens, lacking access to the mechanisms of legal education and interpretation, depended on these experts for guidance and representation. The deliberate ambiguity and opacity of the system shaped social and political relationships, reinforcing hierarchies and perpetuating a quiet imbalance between the formal legal order and the realities of daily life. The laws of Rome, vast and intricate, remained largely unseen by those who lived under their shadow. In the years stretching from the 4th to the 9th centuries CE, Rome's once glittering monumental landscape entered a period of profound transformation. The city, long the beating heart of an empire, faced a slow ebbing of its population and a corresponding decline in the maintenance of its grand structures. The marble-clad temples, triumphal arches, and imposing tombs that had defined the Roman skyline began to show subtle, then unmistakable signs of neglect. As the centuries passed, the very stones of ancient Rome entered into a cycle of dismantling and reuse, fueling the city's ongoing life in ways both practical and adaptive. As the 4th century dawned, Rome was already feeling the pressures of a changing world. Numismatic and demographic studies point to a significant population decline that would continue through the 9th century. Fewer residents meant fewer resources and less labor available for the upkeep of the city's vast array of monumental buildings. The responsibility for maintaining Rome's public spaces, once a cornerstone of imperial policy, began to drift. Earlier centuries had seen emperors and their appointed officials pour funds and attention into construction and restoration, but as imperial energies shifted elsewhere, the burden increasingly fell to local authorities and eventually to ecclesiastical institutions. This transition was not always smooth or complete, leaving many structures without dedicated caretakers. Contemporary legal codes reflect a growing concern for the fate of Rome's monuments. In the 4th century, imperial edicts were issued to prohibit the violation of tombs for their marble ornaments. The Codex Theodosianus, a late Roman legal compilation, prescribed penalties for those who removed decorative elements from funerary monuments. These laws suggest that such acts of stripping were not isolated incidents, but had become enough of a problem to warrant official intervention. Yet the effectiveness of these measures was limited. The gradual reduction in imperial oversight, coupled with the city's dwindling population, meant that enforcement was inconsistent, and the temptation to repurpose valuable materials proved difficult to resist. Literary sources from the 4th and 5th centuries provide vivid glimpses into the state of Rome's monuments during this time. Poets and chroniclers alike recorded scenes of visible neglect and the systematic removal of marble from temples and tombs, both within Rome and in neighboring sites such as Ostia Antica. Around 410 CEE, poetic sources commented on the removal of statues and ornaments from pagan monuments, lamenting the loss of beauty and the city's fading splendor. These observations paint a picture of a city in transition, where once cherished sites were left vulnerable to the elements and to human hands alike. The shifting of administrative responsibility for public buildings further accelerated the decline. As imperial building programs receded, local civic bodies and, increasingly, the Christian Church assumed roles in maintaining certain structures. However, these new custodians often had limited means and different priorities. Ecclesiastical authorities may have focused on churches and related buildings, while letting other monuments languish. The result was a patchwork of care, with some sites maintained, others abandoned, and many left to the slow ravages of time and neglect. Contemporaneous accounts do not shy away from describing the visible effects of this neglect. Observers noted the stripping of decorative marble, the crumbling of rooflines, and the encroachment of vegetation upon once pristine plazas and porticos. The cityscape, once a testament to imperial power and civic pride, bore increasingly obvious scars of abandonment. By the close of the 9th century, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Rome's monumental landscape was marked by visible neglect and diminished oversight, a silent testament to changing times. Alongside this gradual decline, another process unfolded with deliberate purpose. The organized removal and reuse of materials from Rome's ancient structures became a defining feature of urban life in late antiquity and the early medieval period. Archaeological contexts from this era document the systematic incorporation of marble fittings and sculptures from temples and tombs into new public and private buildings, especially during the 4th and early 5th centuries. At Ostia Antica, excavations have revealed that marble elements from abandoned buildings found new life in later constructions, a pattern mirrored in Rome itself. The Aurelian Wall, a massive fortification encircling the city, offers a striking example of this practice. Its fabric contains reused bricks and recut stones taken from earlier structures, demonstrating the organized incorporation of spolia recycled architectural elements into vital defensive works before and during the 4th century. This was not a haphazard process. Epigraphic evidence attests to the existence of organized groups and guilds involved in supplying recycled materials for construction and restoration. Inscriptions reference contractors and demolition specialists, indicating that the dismantling and redistribution of building elements had become a recognized occupation. Imperial projects also participated in this cycle of reuse. During the early 4th century, the Emperor Maxentius undertook renovations that included the reassembly of the Temple of Venus and Roma, making substantial use of original building materials. Such projects not only preserved elements of Rome's architectural heritage, but also demonstrated the pragmatic value of reusing existing resources in new or restored public works. Legal sources of the era indicate that the removal and repurposing of funerary sculpture and marble ornamentation became commonplace in building projects. 4th century laws and later archaeological finds confirm that materials stripped from tombs and temples were in demand for both utilitarian and decorative purposes. The logistics of dismantling, transporting, and integrating these elements required organization and expertise. Contractors and laborers coordinated the careful extraction of marble blocks, the recutting of stone to fit new specifications, and the transport of heavy loads through the city's streets. The motivations for this widespread reuse were both practical and, at times, ideological. The value of marble, bronze, and other materials made them attractive targets in an era of constrained resources. In some cases, the repurposing of pagan monuments may have carried symbolic weight, as Christian authorities and communities sought to redefine the city's sacred landscape. However, much of the activity was driven by necessity. The reuse of durable, high-quality materials from neglected or abandoned monuments offered an efficient solution to the challenges of construction and repair in a city facing economic and demographic decline. By the end of this period, the systematic reuse of Rome's monuments had become a normalized and practical aspect of urban life. The city's ancient stones continued to serve new purposes, woven into the fabric of daily existence and ongoing building activity. The grandeur of the past was not simply erased but transformed, its remnants providing both material and meaning for the generations that followed. Yet, not all of Rome's ancient structures succumbed to dismantling or neglect. Some endured through adaptation, finding renewed purpose as the city's needs and circumstances changed. The most renowned example from this era is the Pantheon. In 609 CE, Pope Boniface IV oversaw its conversion into a Christian church, the Church of Santa Maria ad Martyrs. This adaptation preserved the monumental rotunda, maintaining its architectural integrity while giving it a new role in the spiritual life of the city. The Pantheon's survival attests to the power of adaptive reuse to safeguard ancient monuments amid shifting social and religious priorities. Elsewhere in Rome, similar patterns unfolded. Archaeological and architectural stratigraphy reveal that medieval church foundations from the 8th and 9th centuries frequently incorporated tuffo and other blocks recut from antique buildings. The structural fabric of many Roman monuments in the early medieval period became a palimpsest, combining ancient marble fragments, late antique brickwork, and medieval stone blocks. This patchwork construction technique was both practical and symbolic, linking the enduring presence of Rome's past to the evolving needs of its present. Parts of Domitian's Palatine complex were incorporated into the Santa Maria Antiqua complex, illustrating another form of adaptation and reuse between the 4th and 9th centuries. Here, the remnants of imperial palaces were transformed into ecclesiastical spaces, their walls and foundations supporting new structures and new rituals. The conversion of ancient buildings into churches and ecclesiastical complexes is documented in both documentary and archaeological records from the 7th to 9th centuries. These adaptations often involved structural modifications or additions designed to accommodate new functions, such as the insertion of altars, apses, and baptistries into pre-existing halls and chambers. Official records and inscriptions sometimes mark the adaptation of specific sites, providing insight into the motivations and perspectives of those involved. The conversion of the Pantheon, for example, was not only a practical measure, but also a statement of continuity and transformation, signaling the Christianization of a pagan monument and its incorporation into the living fabric of the city. Other adapted structures, while perhaps less celebrated, played important roles in the daily lives of Rome's inhabitants, offering shelter, worship space, or communal gathering points. Contemporary accounts occasionally reflect on the significance of preserving certain monuments through reuse. The continued presence of these ancient structures, albeit modified, served as a tangible link to Rome's illustrious past. For many residents, the adaptation of old buildings for new purposes was less an act of destruction than one of survival, a means of ensuring the persistence of familiar landmarks in a changing world. Responsibility for these adaptations often rested with ecclesiastical authorities, local leaders, or community groups. Their decisions shaped the city's evolving skyline, determining which monuments would be preserved, repurposed, or left to decay. The choices made during this period set precedents for the treatment of Rome's architectural heritage, balancing reverence for the past with the practical demands of the present. By the close of the 9th century, the city of Rome presented a landscape at once altered and enduring. Many ancient monuments had vanished or been reduced to quarries for building materials, their stones scattered throughout new constructions. Yet others survived, transformed by adaptation into churches, fortifications, and communal spaces. The city's fabric was a mosaic of old and new, a testament to the resilience and utility of its ancient stones. Through neglect, dismantling, and reuse, Rome had dismantled itself, yet, stone by stone, parts of its past persisted, shaped by the hands and needs of generations who found new purpose in the remnants of empire. In the tangled streets and bustling piazzas of Rome, the presence of an ancient city beneath the surface has shaped the daily experience of its inhabitants for centuries. From the 15th century onward, the relationship between the visible and the hidden aspects of Rome has been marked by curiosity, discovery, and a growing sense of responsibility for the preservation of a layered heritage. The city's past, quite literally underfoot, has been revealed in moments of chance and in acts of deliberate exploration, while the living city above has learned to accommodate, protect, and coexist with its monumental foundations. The earliest documented discoveries of ancient remains beneath the city's buildings and streets emerged in the late medieval and early Renaissance periods. Giovanni Dondi dell'Orologio, a physician and clockmaker, journeyed through Rome in the 1370s. In his Iter Romanum, he described the material remains of Roman ruins and recorded numerous inscriptions he encountered, giving a sense of the visible and sometimes partially buried relics that dotted the landscape. His observations reflected a growing scholarly interest in the remnants of antiquity, and his careful documentation suggested that even in the 14th century, the ruins of ancient Rome were not only a physical presence, but also an object of intellectual curiosity. This interest deepened in the early 15th century, with the arrival of Poggio Bracciolini in Rome in 1403. Bracciolini, a noted humanist and collector of manuscripts, began an epigraphical collection, meticulously recording Latin inscriptions found in and around the city. His efforts were part of a broader movement among scholars to recover the textual and material legacy of antiquity, a pursuit that often brought them into direct contact with the city's buried past. Bracciolini's later work, The Ruins of Rome, written between 1431 and 1448, drew on both literary and epigraphical sources to paint a vivid picture of a city where the ancient and the modern were in constant dialogue. In his writing, the ruins were not simply inert objects, but active participants in the intellectual life of the city's residents. The physical discovery of ancient structures beneath newer buildings and streets was often the result of chance as much as design. One of the most celebrated events of the 15th century was the rediscovery of the Domus Aurea, the vast palace of Emperor Nero. This came about through a small crack in a vaulted ceiling, through which explorers descended into the buried chambers. These early visitors, sometimes artists or antiquarians, marveled at the painted walls and strange half-lit spaces, and their accounts circulated among the city's literate elite. The Domus Aurea's accidental unveiling became emblematic of the way Rome's ancient past could emerge unexpectedly from beneath the surface of daily life. Other finds were equally serendipitous. In the early 16th century, the remains of Augustus's massive sundial were uncovered by a baker digging a latrine. The discovery of such a grand relic in the course of an ordinary task underscored the unpredictability of Rome's subterranean riches. Yet even as these finds excited interest, practical limitations often dictated how they were handled. After the sundial was unearthed, Pope Julius II, lacking the necessary funds to pursue further investigation or preservation, ordered the relic to be reburied. This episode highlighted the tension between curiosity and resource constraints, a recurring theme in Rome's relationship with its past. The early 16th century also saw major archaeological activity during works on the Oppian Hill. The uncovering of ancient structures in the course of construction or repair projects became increasingly common, and these episodes were sometimes recorded by scholars or city officials. In Piazza Venezia, archaeologists and technicians unearthed 3 bronze medals bearing the effigy of Pope Paul II, providing a concrete example of how the ancient and more recent histories of Rome could be entangled in a single find. While some discoveries were greeted with scholarly excitement, others were met with indifference or even inconvenience, depending on the interests and resources of those in power. Contemporary accounts from this period occasionally commented on the impact of these discoveries on urban development and property use. The identification of lost buildings by Roman scholars by the end of the 15th century shaped perceptions of the city's layout, even if it did not always result in immediate changes to the built environment. The physical presence of ruins could impede construction or require adaptation, but it could also serve as a source of inspiration and civic pride. The coexistence of ancient and modern structures was thus both a practical and a symbolic reality for the citizens of Rome. As the centuries progressed, the need for a more systematic approach to the preservation and management of Rome's ancient remains became increasingly apparent. The early modern period saw the first steps toward the creation of legal and administrative frameworks governing archaeological excavation and preservation. In 1515, Pope Leo X appointed the painter and architect Raphael as superintendent of antiquities of Rome. This appointment marked a significant moment in the formal recognition of the importance of ancient buildings and artifacts. Raphael, drawing on his deep appreciation for classical art and architecture, called for the preservation of ancient structures in a letter to Pope Leo X in 1519. In this correspondence, Raphael articulated the need for restraint and care in the face of ongoing urban development, emphasizing the value of the city's ancient heritage, not only for its aesthetic qualities, but also for its historical significance. The papal bull, Cum Almam Nostrum Urbem, further reinforced this commitment by condemning the degradation of any ancient building. These early policies established the principle that Rome's ancient remains were not simply the property of whoever happened to uncover them, but were instead a shared inheritance deserving of protection. While enforcement was uneven and often dependent on the priorities of individual popes or city officials, the existence of such regulations signaled a shift in attitudes toward the ancient city. The 19th century saw renewed interest in systematic excavation and preservation, driven in part by advances in archaeological methods and a growing sense of national identity. Carlo Fea, an antiquarian and archaeologist, began an excavation in the Roman Forum to clear the area around the triumphal arch of Septimius Severus. This work, which involved both the removal of later accretions and the careful documentation of ancient structures, set a precedent for future excavations. The turn of the 20th century brought further innovation with the work of Giacomo Boni, who conducted stratigraphic excavations in the Roman Forum. Boni's meticulous approach, which emphasized the importance of context and the layering of historical periods, reflected a new level of scientific rigor in the study of Rome's past. The establishment of boundaries and regulations for archaeological work became increasingly formalized during this period. Institutions and agencies were tasked with overseeing excavation and preservation activities, and specific regulations were enacted to limit construction or digging in historically sensitive areas. These measures were often the subject of negotiation and at times conflict between preservation authorities and property owners, whose interests did not always align. Some contemporaneous accounts noted the challenges of balancing economic development with the need to protect irreplaceable heritage, while others emphasized moments of cooperation and shared purpose. Named individuals such as Raphael, Carlo Fea, and Giacomo Boni played influential roles in shaping preservation policy, lending their expertise and authority to the cause of protecting Rome's ancient remains. Their efforts were supported by a growing network of scholars, technicians, and government officials, whose work laid the foundation for modern archaeological practice in the city. Public attitudes toward preservation boundaries varied, with some residents expressing pride in the city's heritage, and others chafing at the restrictions imposed on property use or development. Nevertheless, by the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, formal boundaries and regulations had been established, shaping how Rome's ancient remains were accessed and protected. Above this carefully regulated and often invisible world, daily life in Rome continued with a blend of practicality and reverence. The city's residents and businesses learned to interact with and accommodate the ancient remains in their routines. In some cases, adaptations were necessary. Buildings and infrastructure were modified to account for buried structures, and public spaces were created to allow access to or enjoyment of archaeological features. One notable example was the transformation of the filled-in Domus Aurea into a public park, providing a green space for all Romans to enjoy, while preserving the remains below. The presence of the ancient city beneath the modern metropolis was not always at the forefront of public consciousness, but it was rarely absent altogether. Awareness of the city's layered history was reinforced through scholarship, public monuments, and everyday encounters with ruins. The act of raising 5 obelisks in the 16th century, following their formal exorcism, illustrated the way in which ancient artifacts could be integrated into the fabric of contemporary life, serving both practical and symbolic purposes. Cultural and social practices often reflected the coexistence of modern and ancient Rome. Scholars such as Poggio Bracciolini, who in 1430 climbed the Capitoline Hill with a friend and observed the ancient forum populated only by pigs, deer, and vegetables, documented the ways in which the city's past and present intersected. Their accounts offered glimpses of a world in which the ruins of empire were repurposed as pasture or garden, and where the boundaries between antiquity and modernity were constantly negotiated. Communities and families living in close proximity to ancient sites sometimes developed a sense of stewardship or attachment to the remains beneath their feet. The experience of archaeologists who penetrated the buried early Christian tombs in the catacombs under the city in the 16th century provided another example of how the search for the past could become part of the city's ongoing story. These explorations, while often restricted to specialists, contributed to a broader sense of continuity and restraint in the management of the city's heritage. In daily urban life, restraint and intentional preservation were sometimes evident in the choices made by individuals and institutions. The decision to create public parks atop archaeological sites, the careful documentation of newly discovered remains, and the willingness to adapt infrastructure to accommodate buried structures all reflected a recognition of the city's layered character. At the same time, the demands of a growing and changing metropolis required constant negotiation between the needs of the present and the claims of the past. By the present day, Rome's ancient foundations remain a silent but persistent influence on the city's character. The coexistence of everyday life and archaeological heritage is expressed in countless ways: in the uneven stones of a street, the unexpected column in a basement, the public park that conceals a palace beneath its lawns. The awareness of this hidden city shapes the rhythms of urban life, encouraging both restraint and imagination. The story of living above the unseen city is thus one of continuity, rather than revelation. From the earliest recorded discoveries in the 15th century to the carefully regulated excavations and daily accommodations of the modern era, Rome's inhabitants have learned to dwell among the traces of their predecessors. The ancient city, though largely invisible, remains an enduring presence, quietly shaping the life that unfolds above its buried walls and streets. In this ongoing relationship between past and present, Rome finds both challenge and inspiration, its identity grounded in the layers of history beneath its surface.